In this episode, we're going to discuss why God cannot be proven with logic even though God exists. And more fundamentally, we're going to deconstruct the very notion of proof. What is proof? This is going to be an epistemic episode where we get into the nature of knowledge and how anything can be known at all, and the trickeries of coming to know God, because God is the most trickiest thing that can be understood. So here's my radical claim for this episode, is that precisely because God exists as an absolute, all proofs of God must fail. What? How can that be? Surely something that exists must be provable, right? Well, turns out that that's wrong. So that's what this whole episode is going to explain. The logic of that, why this is the case, why it has to be this way. And this is something that people who try to present proofs of God don't understand, and they keep making this mistake. Because people who believe in God, rather than having a direct consciousness of God, and these are two very different things, people who believe in God or have faith in God don't know what they're talking about, and therefore they think that a logical proof must be able to get you to God. And of course, the answer is that it can't. But since they don't have direct experience or consciousness of God, they don't understand that. So this topic is not just going to be about God. If you don't care about the God topic, that's fine. There's going to actually be deeper stuff for you here. It's way more fundamental. We're going to be deconstructing the notion of proof, argument, logic, and scientific method. And this is going to be stuff that very few people understand. So here's something I want you to consider, which most people have never considered, who like to wax on and on about proving this and proving that and scientific evidence and so forth. That sounds like you're being very intellectually rigorous when you're asking for, proof of extraordinary claims. The old atheist adage of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That sounds very cute and all that when you say that in some sort of theist debate. But the reality is that the people who say this, they've never actually bothered to contemplate what proof actually means. So proof, as it turns out, is a limited notion. What is proof after all? You can't just take that for granted. You have to question what proof is, what constitutes proof, and what kind of things can be proven. Now, simplistically, scientifically minded and atheistically minded and what I would call rationalist people who subscribe to the rationalist worldview, they simplistically just assume and take for granted that anything that's true of the universe can be proven using scientific method or logic, one of those two methods usually. And as it turns out, that's a false assumption. That's not true. That's generally the case for most phenomenon in the universe. But God is a very special sort of phenomenon. It's not like just an ordinary object found in the world. It's something else. It's an absolute. And so when we're talking about absolutes, that's where this notion of really thinking about proof becomes so important. So let's discuss all this. There's really only three possibilities here. One possibility is that God simply does not exist. The second possibility is that God exists, and because it exists, it can be proven. Seems kind of common sense, right? That's what most atheists assume, is that if God does exist, if they're open-minded enough to even grant that, then then they're going to assume, okay, so then where's the proof of it? But not so fast. There's a third possibility, which is this, is that God exists and it cannot be proven for profound and serious epistemic and ontological reasons. So this is case number 3, and this is actually what's true of the world. But now this needs to be explained because it's not so obvious why this is the case. Because if you're an atheist, you're going to think there's a fourth possibility here, which is that, Leo, you think God exists, but actually you're just fooling yourself, and now you're rationalizing and inventing mental trickery to justify why you don't need to provide evidence or proof for the existence of your magical God. That's like the fourth possibility that atheists would posit here, and what I'm saying is that no, that's false. So let's explain why this is the case. So if God exists, You can either know the existence of God absolutely or not. So just kind of go through the logic with me here. Absolutely or not. So what are the different ways we have of knowing anything in the world, whether it's God or not? Well, we have things like belief, faith, speculation, hypothesis, theory, probability, evidence, scientific experiment, intuition, models, or logical argument. Now, all of that is not absolute. All of that is indirect knowing of a thing. So even a scientific experiment is indirect. Why is it indirect? Because you have to set up the experiment properly. You could fail to do that. You have to interpret the results of the experiment. There's no such thing as a scientific experiment without interpretation of the data. You have to account for proper calibration of your instruments. They could be miscalibrated. You have to take into account possibilities for noise and anomalies in your data. All of this requires careful thinking, planning, and even beyond all of that, what you take the results of your experiment to mean depend upon your hypothetical, metaphysical, priors, assumptions, and frameworks. There's no such thing as running a scientific experiment without theory behind it. Even though many people assume that you can just run a simplistic scientific experiment and just get pure truth. You never get pure truth from a scientific experiment. And a scientific experiment is like the highest standard that we usually have for quote unquote proving things. Well, maybe there's also, you might say, logic. Logic might be an even higher standard than scientific evidence, you might say, because logic, supposedly if you have like a logical deductive proof within mathematics, that's like airtight. It's even more airtight than a scientific experiment, because if you have a deductive proof, you just go through the logical rules and you get the result, and there's no arguing with that. But it turns out that that too is still not direct, and it's not absolute. Well, for a very simple reason is that you could fail to do your logical proof correctly. And there's other reasons which we'll get into here in a moment. Obviously, things like belief and faith are indirect. When you say you believe something, you say you believe in God, that already admits that you don't actually know God. You don't know if God exists, because if you knew God existed, it wouldn't be a belief. So, what's important to recognize is just to do sort of a very basic procedure here epistemically, is just to kind of ground yourself in not knowing. So just ask yourself the question, do you have a direct consciousness of God right now? In this room that you're sitting in, are you experiencing God right now? No? Okay. So then you don't have an experience of God. You don't know God. You don't know if there is a God. And if there is a God, you don't know what God is either. This seems kind of like so stupidly simple and obvious, but like most people can't even admit this to themselves. There are many people who are going to watch this who have a belief in God and faith in God, and they're just going to be nodding along and saying, yes, Leo, God exists. And what I'm telling you is that no, you don't know that God exists. Are you conscious of God right now directly? No. So what you have is a belief or faith, and that's not good enough for understanding God. And in fact, it's going to be antithetical. It's going to prevent you from understanding God. And you're going to start to use various kinds of poor logic and arguments for justifying your beliefs in God. So what I'm suggesting you do is you get very honest with yourself and you admit that you don't know what God is. And you don't even know if it exists. That's the truth underneath all your beliefs and faith. This is true whether you're a theist, and it's true whether you're an atheist. So just recognize that for yourself right now. This is very fundamental. This authentic not knowing opens up a possibility for us to do serious philosophy. Because without this, there is no serious philosophy. All you're going to be doing is you're just going to be recapitulating your priors and biases and your beliefs. And that's not interesting. That doesn't get you anywhere. and we're actually trying to get somewhere. We're trying to get to the truth of the matter. So there's only two possibilities. Either absolutes exist or they don't exist. And you probably don't know which of these is true. And you're probably wondering, well, what is an absolute? Well, if you're asking that question, then you definitely don't know whether they exist or not, because you don't even know what an absolute is. See, science and even logic deals with relative matters, not absolute matters. Contingent things. And when we're talking about God, we're talking about absolutes. Now, you might say, well, there's no such thing as absolutes. But then I would tell you, how do you know that? So you have to keep your mind open to the possibility that there is such a thing as an absolute. You just haven't encountered it yet. And maybe one day you'll encounter it. And that will be another thing. And see, when I'm talking about an absolute, now this is very interesting, a very interesting possibility, is I'm talking about an encounter with the absolute, which is not mediated by perception or by experience or by scientific method or by logic. Absolute. What that means is you can have an encounter with absolute truth. That's not a possibility that most human beings have ever considered. Scientists don't consider this because they don't deal with this kind of stuff. They don't deal with absolutes. Logicians and mathematicians, they don't deal with absolutes either. You might think that 1 + 1 = 2 is an absolute. That's not what I mean by absolute. What I'm talking about by absolute is more absolute than that, if you think that's absolute. So at this point, it's interesting because your mind has to kind of go down one or two pathways here. Is you either have to open your mind to the possibility of this mysterious absolute, or you have to deny it and say, Leo, you're talking about some sort of fantasy here of absolute truth, which we know is impossible, and it just doesn't exist. But again, I would ask you, how do you know it doesn't exist? Just because you haven't encountered it thus far in your life? That doesn't say very much. That's not very convincing. You shouldn't be convinced by that. You should be skeptical of your own skepticism of the existence of the absolute. Also, you should notice that proof and logic are not absolute, even though they might seem that way. But when we're talking about God, we're talking about absolutes. And understanding an absolute is very different in kind from understanding the relative. This is where everybody goes wrong. They assume that God is a relative thing, like all other things in the world, and so it can be approached with the same methodology as you can approach other things. That's just not true. That's not the case. And you have to open your mind very radically to this possibility that there is something very different from what you're normally used to investigating when you're doing science. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck only exploring the relative domain, which is good from a certain point of view. That's what science does, but it then cuts off the possibility of something beyond science. And of course, this is a dogma that many scientists and rationalists hold, is that, Leo, there's just nothing beyond science. Science is all there is. But again, my question to you is, how do you know that? You might say, well, science says so, but how do you know science is right? Has it been proven? This is where you have to be very, very careful. And you don't want to jump and assume things about science. You don't want to, for example, assume that science has proven that there's no such thing as absolutes, or that scientific method is all that there is, and that all phenomenon in the universe can be described by scientific method. You can't assume that. Or, I mean, if you do, you're going to be doing bad science. Now, let's take a look at why proof and logic are not absolute. First of all, logical proof can always be mistaken. You have to go through steps in your mind. You have to go through a thinking process. Your thinking process can be flawed. That's very obvious. So here's an interesting question for you. How can you be sure that your logical proofs are really true? Well, you could say, well, we can go through it twice and 3 times, triple check our logical proof just to make sure. Okay, that's nice. But what if the problem is deeper than just making an error, but the problem is more like the actual mental machinery that you're using to do this proof itself is faulty? How can you insure against that mistake? You could say, well, if my mental machinery is faulty, I could distribute the proof to a bunch of other logicians and they can go through it, and then we can combine them all together and we could see, what the consensus is. Seems reasonable, but how do you insure against the problem of groupthink and confirmation bias? Maybe there are predispositions and biases within the culture of all of these logicians, such that they're all going to be making the same mistake because they're all using the same assumptions, the same theoretical paradigms. Furthermore, how do you know that the logical machinery within their minds is also not equally faulty as in your own? Maybe there's just a flaw, for example, within all human neurophysiology and biology, which makes it such that humans do logic in a faulty way that isn't true to ultimate reality, for example. Maybe it works here locally on Earth for our little human needs, just to survive and to do stuff. But if we're talking about God, we're talking about the question of the ultimate nature of existence, effectively. So how do we know that our logical machinery will transfer over to that? How can you be sure of that? See, now we're starting to get into some serious epistemology. Now we're really doubting stuff, right? The mistake here that scientists make is that they're not skeptical enough. They think they're being skeptical. They're not being skeptical enough. That's the trick. And look, humans have commonly throughout history made mistakes that stem from groupthink and mass delusions and cultural bias. And you might say, well, Leo, we could involve multiple cultures. Maybe, for example, if Western culture has certain biases, we can distribute our proof across many different cultures and then gather a consensus across all the cultures. And in this way, we can overcome this doubt that you have about this kind of groupthink and cultural bias. No, the doubt is deeper than that, because that's not good enough. Because what I'm going to claim is that the human race itself, the entire human species, is biased. And the way that it does knowledge seeking, the way it does sense making, and the way that it does logic could be flawed in such a profound way that the human species itself doesn't even recognize it yet. So how do you account for that? Well, that's very difficult. So see, now you're starting to see why proof and logic are not absolute. Furthermore, proof and logic can be misused. They often are. After all, we're dealing with the ego mind, and the ego mind co-opts and uses logic and proof for its own selfish purposes. So how can you be sure that you're not misusing logic and proof? Every logical argument ultimately is vulnerable to self-deception. Even if the logical steps that you're using are technically sound and rigorous and would pass, for example, the checking of some sort of computer that checks for logical rules and fallacies. Just because your logical proof passes all of those tests does not mean that you're not going to use that now to come to some sort of faulty conclusions. Because when we're talking about the application of logic to sense-making, the project of sense-making is not just as simple as knowing some objective fact out in the world. It's much more rich and robust than that. Sense-making is much more abstract, high-level, and conceptual, and it's just much richer than that. We're talking about something that's much richer than a simple proof of a mathematical proof usually is proving a simple equation. But when we're talking about the understanding of the ultimate nature of reality, we're not talking about a simple equation here. We're talking about something much richer, which is much more prone to self-deception and errors and mistakes, And it doesn't lend itself very easily to just a simple like modus ponens, logical deduction, sort of simplistic proof, that the kind of proofs that you would do in a freshman logic class. Those kind of proofs have a very limited domain of applicability. There's very little within reality that you can actually understand phenomenon within the actual real world that just would lend itself to those kinds of proofs. Does that mean that the phenomenon isn't real? No. Does that mean that you can't understand the ultimate nature of reality? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that your logical deduction method is extremely finite and limited in what it can accomplish. See, so what we're looking at here is the limits of logic, the limits of proof. Now, when we're talking about the limits of any method, whether it's science, anything, religion, it's important to understand that when we're talking about limits, it doesn't mean that the thing itself is useless entirely or that it's entirely wrong. It just means that it's limited. So be careful not to assume too much here of what we're saying. I'm not saying to be irrational now and to never use logic. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there's limits and we need to study and acknowledge those limits. And so just for your sake, if you don't believe me about all this God stuff, great. I don't want you to believe me. But just here's something you can take away very practically from this episode that will change your whole life, epistemologically, is this. Sit down, just in a room, sit down by yourself and ask yourself, what are the limits of logic and what are the limits of proof? And just sit there for a few hours and think it through for yourself. You don't have to believe anything I say about the matter. Think it through for yourself. That will be very useful for you. If you're going to go on to be a scientist, an academic, a researcher, this exercise will be huge for you. Sit down and do that. The next point is the reason that proof and logic are not absolutes is that the feeling of soundness that you get from an argument does not guarantee its truth. Just because logic tells you that God must exist doesn't mean God does exist. And just because logic tells you that God probably doesn't exist doesn't mean God doesn't exist. Usually when people are doing logic, really that logic is hinging upon actually sort of a hidden intuition. It's sort of like what they're doing is they're running logic and then they're getting a conclusion and they're checking that conclusion against their intuitions and priors. And then they're kind of asking themselves like, well, is that plausible? And if it's plausible, then they accept it. And if it's not plausible, they reject the logic. Right? So it's not as simple as like you're just a logical machine that goes through the world and understands things logically. That's not how humans make sense of reality. Even scientists and logicians don't do that. Even for example, a mathematician, when he's doing a calculation, at the end, he gets his number. At the end of all that calculating, he gets his number, and then he does a quick intuition check on that number to see, is this roughly in the right ballpark? Because you could do your math wrong. But then what happens when your intuition is corrupted or your intuition has very deep epistemic flaws in it or hidden assumptions and priors that you're not aware of that you got from culture and so forth? So you're using priors that you got from your culture to do your intuition check on your logic, you see? And this creates a sort of a question-begging problem. Because if there's an error in your culture, that error will be baked into how they teach you logic and how you apply your logic and then how you check your logic. And so in this way, very deep blind spots can occur even within logic and its application. And remember, there's logic and there's application of logic. So those are also distinct things. And really, you have to ensure that your application of it is correct. Ultimately, every argument needs to ground in some external truth to the argument itself. Unless you're talking about something as just like very simple as, A equals A or 1 equals 1. If you're just talking about like this purely tautological symbolic truth, maybe you don't need to ground it in any kind of external truth or experience But as far as when we're talking about investigating the actual physical world and what's true of it and what isn't true, all of your logic ultimately has to be tested against what? Some kind of ground, which is experience. And experience is also what I'm calling truth here. So truth turns out to be more fundamental than proof or method. All logic depends upon the existence of truth. If there wasn't truth, you couldn't even do logic. But now truth is a very loaded word. What does truth even mean? That's not something I'm going to go into here. I have a different episode about that called What is Truth, where we can talk about that. That's all explained for you already. But I'm just going to point out here that truth is a very loaded word, and most logicians and scientists and rationalists have no idea what truth even means for very profound reasons. Because as it turns out, truth is actually an absolute. It's not a relative matter, and it's more fundamental than proof, than evidence, than scientific method, and even than logic, or the way that humans use logic. Proof is a relativistic and subjective matter because no two people have the same standards for what counts as proof. What might constitute a proof for me may not constitute as a proof for you. So then the question arises, how much and what kind of evidence and proof do you need to be convinced? You see, and that's a very relative, subjective matter. So you can't just ask in the abstract, like, okay, give a airtight proof for God. You can't just have that kind of expectation, put it out there, and expect somebody to meet it. Because, of course, what does airtight really mean? What does it really mean to prove anything at all? We'll get to that in much more depth as we keep going. But let me just ask you here, just kind of as a hypothetical. Let's say that God appeared to you in the middle of the night and raped you in your sleep. Would you consider that as proof for the existence of God? I'm serious. Don't chuckle. This is real. Like, do this thought experiment in your mind. Imagine this happened to you tonight. Would that be enough to convince you? And now my question to you is, if not, then what would count as proof for you? Because if that's not going to convince you, how do you expect anything to convince you? You have to be careful that you don't set your expectations so absurdly high that literally nothing could convince you, right? Because again, we're dealing with the ego mind, and the ego mind is very sneaky. You have to always remind yourself that the ego mind has a virtually infinite capacity for denial. Could deny anything it wants to. Here's how a scientist might deny it. A scientist might say, well, yeah, God appeared and raped me, but that was just a hallucination. It was just a dream. So it didn't really happen, or at the very least, I can't be sure. So as a proper scientist, I have to say that even then, I'm not convinced of the existence of God, because this thing that appeared and raped me, maybe it wasn't God. Maybe I think it's God, but I was mistaken. See, a true skeptic would say something like that. But you see, you have to be very careful here about your double standards. Because would you apply that same logic, for example, if you were mauled by a bear? If a bear broke through your window and mauled you and then ran away, would you say that there's good proof and evidence that you were mauled by a bear? See, you wouldn't doubt that. Why don't you doubt that? Well, because to you, a bear is a very plausible, you have a naturalistic explanation. Your worldview accommodates the existence of bears mauling people. It does not accommodate the reality of God raping people. But here you have to be very, very careful because, again, where are you getting your notion of what is plausible? What is realistic? What can be within the bounds of reality? See, this you get from your culture, and this you get from prior experience. You've seen many TV shows of, in the Hollywood movies, men getting mauled by bears. So to you, there's nothing crazy about that possibility. even though it's pretty rare. But God, that's some sort of woo-woo stuff. That can't be real. But again, how do you know that, right? You have to be very careful not to question beg here. Also, consider that most human beings would consider it a proof, if they were raped by God in the middle of the night, that is a proof of the existence of God. So you, as the atheist skeptic here, are actually in the minority when you want to be so skeptical that you wouldn't even call that a proof. So notice what that shows us. That shows us that the very notion of proof is relative. Because to most people, they would think that is proof of God. But to you, you're so skeptical that to you, no, it's not proof. It's not good enough. It doesn't meet your standard. Okay, but then that shows that different people have different standards. And why should we use your standard rather than my standard or somebody else's standard or the majority standard? See? So now we're starting to see just how tricky this notion of proof is. You can't just take this stuff for granted. Now, you as an atheist, you might say like, well, Leo, we should have the highest possible standard. Sure, of course, many stupid people out in the world are very superstitious and they're willing to believe anything. They believe in Bigfoot and UFOs and whatever nonsense. So, of course, we don't want to use their weak standards. We want to use the ultimate academic standard of like double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, that kind of standard. Okay, but you see, now don't stop with your skepticism there. Be skeptical, but like really be skeptical. Because if you're really skeptical, then you have to ask yourself, well, but this standard of double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, is this really the kind of standard that all phenomena in the universe should be able to clear? What if there's phenomena that doesn't clear that kind of bar? How do you subject all phenomena to that standard? So maybe if you set your standard too low, you will delude yourself. That's certainly true. If you have no standard at all, you'll delude yourself. But now you have to continue with your skepticism and realize that if you set your standard too high, if you create an artificial standard based on your own personal fears and paranoias and concerns, then you'll also delude yourself because there will be things that are true which do not clear that ridiculous artificial standard. After all, if you really want to be skeptical, you can deny the existence of the entire world. Anything that I say happened to me, you can always say, well, Leo, you just hallucinated it. Yeah, you could always make that kind of argument about anything. So you have to be very careful with this application of this skeptical line of like, well, Leo, if God raped you in the middle of the night, it was just a hallucination and you couldn't really tell the difference. See, if you're going to use that, then I get to use that against everything you say is true too. See, if you say, well, I know that the moon is real, I could say, well, you're just hallucinating the moon. And if you say, well, general relativity is real because Einstein proved it, I get to say you hallucinated Einstein. And if you say, no, I didn't, I went to school and I studied and I did the physics, I went through all the physics classes and I know that general relativity is valid, I get to say you hallucinated that you went to university and to high school. You see, two can play this game. See, if we're going to really be skeptical and play this game, I will out-skeptic you. You're not going to out-skeptic me. I will out-skeptic you. So are you sure you want to play this game? See, here is where the kind of false skeptic, the guy who's not really truly skeptical, who's just playing games, will stop his skepticism. He'll draw an arbitrary line and say, well, Leo, we're going to be skeptical up to a certain point, and then beyond that point, it's just ridiculous. It's like, Leo, now you're just being ridiculous. I didn't go to school. I didn't study physics. Of course I did. No, I'm not granting you that. But you're going to say, no, Leo, you've gone too far. You've gone into cuckoo land. You see, and my point to you now is that where you're drawing that line as far as when to stop your skepticism, that is where the self-deception happens. That's where the real self-deception happens. Because where you draw that line is based on where from your culture you got your ideas of what's plausibly realistic and true and valid of the world and what isn't. And that is where the self-deception comes from, because what you get from your background culture, all your assumptions and priors and what you think is plausible and implausible. For example, do you believe it's plausible that Bigfoot could be real? Whether you do or don't, it doesn't matter. The point is that you got that from your culture. And now you're going to be using that to now set your standards of skepticism. And so my whole point here is that these rationalist type of people who like to put on this air of being very rigorous and scientific and hard-nosed, that they're actually playing this game and that they're not being so. And really what they're doing is that they're using this to just recapitulate and reinforce and confirmation bias themselves with the background assumptions that they got from their culture. And this is usually people who went through university, went into the STEM fields, and by going through that education system, they've gotten very strong priors of like Bigfoot can't exist and ghosts can't be real and there's no such thing as mermaids and there's no such thing as unicorns and there's no such thing as God. And what I'm saying is that if you're going to truly do an investigation into the nature of the universe, you have to be so open-minded and so serious about not knowing and not assuming anything that you have to be extremely careful not to question beg using your cultural priors that you got from your STEM education. So here's a line of skepticism for you that is very serious. What if your standards by which you're judging what's plausible and implausible, what if those are wrong? See, that's real skepticism. I've heard some atheists argue that even if they met God face to face, it would still be more rational for them to assume that it was a hallucination or a mental illness than actual God. So my question to you is, if you're thinking that way, notice first of all how subjective that is. That's your personal interpretation of the matter. That's you setting your personal standard. And how do you know if you're setting your standard correctly? What if, imagine this scenario, what if God did appear to you, but you were so skeptical and so brainwashed with your cultural background assumptions from your STEM education that you denied that it was God and you told yourself, oh man, I must be suffering from a mental psychotic breakdown, and you check yourself into a mental health facility. And there, some ignorant psychologist tells you, oh yeah, you didn't see God, you were just hallucinating, and then they give you some pills, and then you calm down, and you go back home, and then your life is normal. And you think, oh yeah, I did, I had this mental psychotic break one time in my life. Of course there's no God. And so here's where this is real skepticism. What if all of that was wrong, and you were just fooling yourself because you don't want to just admit that you actually had an encounter with God? See? Notice how tricky this is. Notice that your mind, even the scientific mind, has an infinite capacity for denial. You can actually use science and atheism and materialism to deny even authentic supernatural experiences. For example, you might have an experience with a ghost, and I'm not saying ghosts are real. I've never met a ghost. But hey, I'm open to them. But many scientifically minded people are not open to ghosts. But here's my point. The important point is that if you're so closed-minded scientifically that you believe that there can't be ghosts, you might actually have an encounter with a ghost, and then you might tell yourself that it was a hoax or that you had a mental psychotic break, even though you actually had an encounter with a real ghost. See? So I want you to really open your mind to this possibility. And I'm not saying it in the simplistic sense that like, well, Leo, okay, so now you want me to believe in anything. You want me to believe anything is possible. Well, actually, yeah, I do want you to open your mind to that possibility that literally anything is possible, but not in this kind of like stupid sense that like now you have no, you throw all logic out the window, you expect you'll just believe stuff blindly without evidence. I don't want you to go that far. But I do want you to be open to the possibility that, for example, you might encounter a real ghost and that it's not a mental break. And that the mental break excuse is actually an excuse. So here's my question to you is that what evidence and proof do you need personally to know with absolute certainty that God exists? And if you say, Leo, nothing could ever prove it to me, because God is such an outrageous idea that literally it's more likely that I've lost my mind than I've encountered God. Well, if that's your position, I want you to notice that actually you're not being rational. You might tell yourself you're being rational, but you're not. You might tell yourself you're being scientific, but you're not. You're just being closed-minded. Your position actually is unfalsifiable and question-begging. Because God might actually exist, but you are so bought into the idea that he can't possibly exist, that no matter how it presents itself to you, how God interacts with you, you'll never allow it. And I want you to notice that your mind is so powerful that literally you have the power to deny a direct confrontation with God. That's not usually a possibility that most skeptics and atheists take seriously. But I want you to just to sit there and really pause this and think about to yourself, what kind of proof would you need to absolutely be certain that God exists? And if you think that, well, nothing, because in the end it could all just be a hallucination, then I want you to then to apply that standard to the rest of your life as well. Don't just use that standard for God. Use that standard for everything. Because what I want you to see is that you can't meet your own standard. Your standard is nonsensical. Because, for example, I could say, well, what if science and rationalism and atheism is just a mental illness? Oh, well, Leo, that's not fair to say. Who are you to say that? Why should we believe you? Maybe you're mentally ill. What I want you to notice is that you're always smuggling notions of plausibility into the way that you reason and logic, into the way that you do science. There's no such thing as doing science without smuggling in notions of plausibility, which is where all the self-deception occurs, which is where all the epistemic blunders of science throughout history have come from. Science is always discovering new things that break our conventional notions of what is plausible about the nature of the universe. Science discovers things like that we evolved from apes. And at one point that was rather implausible, and many people had difficulty believing that. Science discovers that the universe is expanding at some crazy rate, and that seems implausible. And science discovers that the Earth is orbiting around the sun at some crazy velocity, and that seems implausible. And then it discovers that there are trillions of other planets out there, and that seems implausible. And it discovers that, time and space are relative. People move relative to each other. The faster you move towards the speed of light, your physical dimensions actually change and shape and morph. You age faster or slower depending on the speed you're moving at, like these crazy, weird things. This seems highly implausible. Right? So science is always discovering this sorts of stuff. And so that's the history of science. And so you have to be open to the possibility that this is continuing into the future, and that science isn't done, and science will discover many more implausible things. And that really these notions of plausibility is where we get into trouble, because they're subjective, relative, and sociological in nature. And also, I want you to notice the following point, which is that if you deny that experience of God counts as proof, then your whole worldview is actually incoherent. Because for your worldview to be coherent requires admitting the validity of experience. You cannot have a scientific worldview or a rationalist or an atheist or even a skeptic worldview where you deny the validity of experience. Because what is science? Experience. What is rationality? Experience. What is logic? Experience. What is mathematics? It's an experience. What is skepticism? It's an experience. Why are you even skeptical of things? The only reason you're skeptical of things is because you have an experience that it's possible to delude yourself when you're not being skeptical enough, right? That's why you're skeptical. Why are you a scientist? Why are you so insistent on defending science? Well, it's because you have an experience of alternatives to science, like superstition, ridiculous cult religions, and New Age nonsense. You have all these experiences of people doing bad epistemology, bad science, pseudoscience, and you don't like the results of that. You think it leads to dangerous things like anti-vaxxers and flat earthers and conspiracy theorists and whatever else. And you believe that's bad. That's bad for the world. Where'd you get these ideas? From experience. So even when you're being the most skeptical, just realize how much of your sense making, as a skeptic, you're still doing a crap ton of sense making. And all of that is based in experience. And see, now if you're going to say, well, experience can just be a hallucination and a mental illness, okay, so then your skepticism can be a mental illness too. But why don't skeptics consider skepticism to be a mental illness? It's because of their priors, right? Their cultural conditioning tells them that it's okay to be skeptical. Skepticism isn't a mental illness. It's just normal. But what counts as normal? You see? What if our entire culture and society is sick and deluded? Then normal doesn't save you anymore. You're going to want to say that, Leo, of course we admit that experience is mostly real, but there's different kinds of experience. There's more realistic and probable experiences, and there's lesser ones. For example, it's realistic to experience a bear, and a bear being real, that's realistic, whereas experiencing a ghost is unrealistic, and that's very improbable. Experiencing Bigfoot, not all these experiences are equal. Okay. But that's question begging, do you see? Because the question for us is, what kind of experiences can be had out there in the world? We don't really know. We have to go out there and experience stuff. And if you're just honest with yourself, you'll admit to yourself that your experience of the universe is very tiny. Tiny, tiny, like 0.00001%, even less than that, of the universe have you experienced. So you have to be very careful about assuming what kind of experiences are probable and realistic and what kinds are not. Because that's where you can go wrong. That's where your skepticism should be directed to. There is a very legitimate function to skepticism. It's this kind of like meta epistemic stuff. Not in denying specific phenomena. See, a low-quality skeptic will deny the existence of ghosts and unicorns and dragons and so forth. That's a low-quality skeptic. That's like a stupid kind of skepticism. A really serious skeptic will actually think about, how do I even know that I'm applying my skepticism correctly and that I'm not overusing it, for example? How do I know that skepticism isn't just like some brainworm that I picked up from my culture just because my culture is in this kind of like, there's this intellectual fad of being skeptical about everything. How do I know I didn't just pick that up? And then I'm abusing skepticism and misusing skepticism. See, that is a real application of skepticism when you're applying it to these like deeper, truly, seriously self-deceptive problems. Notice that proof and evidence is cultural and sociological. Different cultures and eras have different ideas of what counts as proof and evidence. Consider how much cultural conditioning shapes metaphysical priors. Science, materialism, rationalism are not neutral. They come with metaphysical priors that come with today's culture. And the metaphysical priors of today's culture are different than what they were 1,000 years ago. And you can be sure that 1,000 years from now, all that is going to change. See, this is where your skepticism should really be applied. Consider the possibility that people's convictions in theism and atheism are not grounded in proof or evidence. They're just assumptions and beliefs that were picked up from culture. If you grew up in a religious household, then you're going to have certain metaphysical priors about the plausibility of God being real. And if you went and you grew up in an atheist household, in a secular household, and you went through the entire STEM education system, then you have the exact opposite assumptions and beliefs because that's the culture you went through. Don't assume that the STEM education system that you went through in university, that this is somehow neutral. It's not neutral. It's a cultural system. And you were conditioned very seriously by that cultural system. Don't forget, you spent 15, 20 years in that system, jumping through its hoops, getting good grades like a good little boy or girl, passing its tests, memorizing what they told you to memorize without even questioning it very much. Don't forget you went through all that. If you're skeptical, what you're worried about is you're worried about fantasy. That's why you want proof, is because you want to avoid falling for some kind of fantasy. But again, here's another oversight that these rationalist people make, is that fantasy isn't just unicorns and dragons and ghosts and Bigfoot. Fantasy is also secular and rationalist. You can have a rationalist, materialist fantasy about the universe. You can tell yourself that the universe is this clockwork machine that is dumb. That operates deterministically by cold mathematical rules. And that there's nothing out there but atoms and molecules. That's a fantasy. Recognize that. Fantasy doesn't just mean outlandish. Fantasies can also be very grounded seeming. They're not really grounded. They seem like they're grounded because they're just kind of like more modest, more plain. Don't forget that possibility. Recognize and admit that no matter how rigorous you think you are, you're actually not that rigorous in your own life. You assume many things in your own life. You operate on belief all the time. You believe many things which cannot be proven, and you don't expect them to be proven. So see, there's double standards in what you even apply your standards of proof and evidence for. The stuff that you like, that fits into your priors and that works with your survival and works with your existing beliefs, that stuff, you don't set a very high standard for proof for that stuff. But the stuff that challenges or contradicts your assumptions, that's the kind of stuff that you set your standards so high that nothing can even clear it. And through this shifting of the standard of proof, this is how your mind really controls your sense of reality. Because by just shifting the standard and not even being conscious that this is happening, this is mostly happening unconsciously for you, you're able to maintain a certain paradigm and view of the world, thinking that that's reality when it really isn't. It's just that your mind is playing these tricks behind the scenes. Again, this is a serious and proper application of skepticism. And it's actually not possible for you to go through life proving everything rigorously for important metaphysical and epistemic reasons. The nature of consciousness as such is that you can't just lock it all down. You can't just simplistically know the world. Something much more complex is going on than just simply looking out into the world and collecting a bunch of facts and then just knowing it. That's not how you're making sense of the world. The world is much more tricky than that. And so what I'd like to suggest is that these people who pretend to be very scientific and rationalist, that actually what they're doing is they're LARPing as that. They're pretending like they're more rigorous than they really are. And this is something you should be skeptical about, because if you pretend to be more rigorous than you actually are, and you have double standards in your application of rigor, for example, you set the standard very high for the woo stuff, and then you ignore the standard when you're dealing with the STEM fields, science stuff, materialism, this will create a self-deception. This is what you should be worried about as a skeptic. Another point to consider here is that science has a dogma against doing metaphysics. It refuses it, and it wants to just assume pure empiricism. Science assumes that scientific method applies to all truths and aspects of reality. This is actually an unproven assumption. This is a huge assumption. It's impossible to actually verify that scientific method applies to all aspects of reality. You can't prove that. You just assume that. And you should be skeptical of that. You should be skeptical of anything that you just assume. By refusing to do metaphysics, science can never reach fundamentally enough to grasp God. Because science wants God to be third-person objectifiable, treated as an objective phenomenon. But as it turns out, God doesn't work that way. And science wants to use finite methods, relative methods, to try to grasp God, but you can't do that because God is infinite. You're trying to use the finite to grasp the infinite. It's not going to work. You're trying to use the relative to grasp the absolute. That's not going to work. And scientists and atheists, they just don't see that. It's a very simple oversight. I want to present to you a list of the core assumptions of the atheist, scientist, materialist, rationalist, skeptic worldview. These are sort of we're unearthing here the metaphysical and epistemic priors and assumptions of this worldview and this paradigm, so that they become very clear and so you can start to see the limits of it. So here's the list. Metaphysics is not important. That's a common assumption within that worldview. Another one is metaphysics is nonsensical. You can't even make sense of what metaphysics is. It's just a nonsense word. It's a nonsense field. Or another assumption is that metaphysics is impossible. Another one is that science does not have a metaphysics, nor does it need one. You can just somehow magically do science without metaphysics. Many scientists believe this. Another assumption is that if God existed, science would surely know about it, because science can know anything by running an experiment. So if something is true, we can just run an experiment on it and prove its existence. Another assumption is that if God exists, science could prove it. Why do you assume that? How would you know such a thing? How could science know that? Just because you can prove the existence of stuff on Earth and in the larger, universe, you think that just now means that science is capable of proving the existence of God? No, that's not a logical, nor a scientific, nor any kind of rigorous conclusion. See, this is what I mean by scientists pretending like they're rigorous. They're not really rigorous. Another assumption is that everything true can be proven. That's not obvious. Why? Why can't there be true things that cannot be proven? Think about it. Why do you assume that? Another assumption is that if God exists, it should be provable against endless skepticism and debunking claims or attempts. Why? Why should that be true? Why can't it be the case that God exists, and if you're such a absurd skeptic to the nth degree that by your own skepticism, you will cut yourself off from the existence of God? Why can't that be the case? Why can't it be the case that skepticism can be its own self-deception? Why can't that be the case? Why haven't you considered that? Why do you assume that it can't? Another assumption is that if God exists, you'll be able to understand God conceptually just sitting there in your armchair. Why would that be the case? Another assumption is that God cannot exist simply because it's too silly for there to be a God. Another assumption is that by God, what we are talking about is the Christian version of God. Don't assume that. Maybe there is a God, but the God we're talking about is not the Christian God that you think we're talking about. And so you're fooling yourself by mistaking what we're really talking about. Why can't that be the case? Another assumption is that God is a human invention. How do you know that for sure? Another assumption is that if God existed, it would be empirically obvious in the same way that, like Leo, nobody disputes the existence of the sun. Everybody believes in the sun because we can see it. So if God existed, it would be like the sun. Everybody would know about it, and there would be no arguments and no controversy, and you wouldn't need thousands of years of metaphysics. But how do you know that God would be like the sun? Maybe God is not like the sun. Maybe God is sneaky, tricky, hidden in some kind of interesting way. After all, there's a lot of phenomena within the universe that is quite hidden and difficult to ascertain, difficult to pin down. Another assumption is that your worldview is grounded in proof, logic, and science, and that you are a logical actor. Why do you assume that you're a logical actor? Why don't you, for example, see that the ego can co-opt logic and then use it for its own selfish purposes? You assume, for example, that a common assumption is that a logical proof of God is simply impossible. Why do you assume that? Or you might assume that reason and logic is more fundamental than God. But what if God is more fundamental than reason and logic? If God comes before reason and logic, why do you assume that reason and logic can reach back underneath deep enough to reach God? Another assumption is that science is more fundamental than God. But what if God is more fundamental than science? Another assumption is that God is unfalsifiable and therefore unscientific. Another assumption is that any experience of God cannot be trusted as proof. Another assumption is that objectivity is more fundamental than subjectivity. So if God exists, it has to exist in the third person objective. And that, for example, if you have a subjective experience of God, well, that's just subjective. And we all know subjective just means unreliable. See, but that whole line of argument, notice, depends upon you marginalizing subjectivity and putting objectivity on a pedestal. But if you're being very skeptical, what if your notions of objective and subjective are backwards? After all, how do you know what is objective? What does it mean for something to be objective? That's not obvious at all, if you dig into that one. That's a whole can of worms. Because after all, aren't you a subject who is talking to me about objectivity? You say, Leo, you're not being objective enough. But you're a subject saying that. So you're contradicting the very notion of objectivity even when you're complaining about people not being objective enough. Could objectivity even exist without the existence of you, the subject? Don't assume that. Don't assume there is an objective world. And if you really want to get skeptical with me, remember I said I'll out-skeptic you any day of the week. If you want to really get skeptical, then here's my skepticism for you is be skeptical about there being an objective world at all. Where's the proof? Where's the proof of an objective world? Show me the proof. Prove to me anything objective at all. You can't. It's impossible. Any proof you muster of objectivity is going to be subjective because it's going to be happening within your experience, my experience. And we're subjects. Another assumption is that other minds exist who can corroborate the existence of God for you. This sort of idea that, well, Leo, if God exists, then we should be able to come up with a proof, and then multiple people should be able to corroborate and cross-reference each other's experiences of God. In this way, maybe we can have an experience of God which isn't a hallucination. And what I would say to you, yeah, but that assumes that other minds are real. Don't assume that. Another assumption is that if God existed, it would appear as an object within the universe, like God is some sort of black hole that you just find out there somewhere. Don't assume that. Another assumption is that everything that exists is contingent and that God is also contingent, as if like, well, the moon exists, but it could not have existed. The existence of the moon is just a contingent, accidental, rather arbitrary circumstance that came about when the solar system was forming. It could have easily not existed. And same thing, the entire Milky Way galaxy could have not existed. Just if the matter in the universe was slightly differently arranged, there would be no Milky Way galaxy and no human beings. Seems kind of plausible. And then you kind of assume, well, God can also be this way. It could not exist, it could exist, and we don't really know. But what if God is not a contingent? Don't assume that. Another assumption is that reality can be thought about using Bayesian reasoning and probabilistically. Like, well, I assign a 50% chance that such and such exists, and I assign a 2% probability chance that God exists, and I assign a 5% chance that Bigfoot exists, and I assign a 0% chance to ghosts existing. This is kind of like Bayesian reasoning. But don't assume that that's valid reasoning. There's another common assumption, which is that atoms are more plausible and realistic than God. For example, you have no problem accepting the existence of atoms. But God, that's implausible. Another assumption is that you have enough intelligence to realize what God is. Don't assume that at all. See? Maybe God exists, but you're just not intelligent enough to know it. Another assumption is that even one atom could exist without God. See, you're assuming that. You're assuming atoms can just exist. Where did atoms come from? Well, somewhere they just exist. And to you, that's plausible. See, this is what I mean by plausibility that you picked up from your background. The only reason you accept that even a single atom can just exist is because your culture tells you that that's okay. It's okay to believe that. But do you see this kind of like the arbitrariness and plausibility when we're talking about atoms? Like, for example, to a scientist, it's plausible that atoms just exist out of nowhere for no reason. That's kind of plausible. But if you say that just, Bigfoot exists out of nowhere for no reason, that's very implausible to a scientist. But why would a Bigfoot just existing for no reason be any more implausible than one atom existing just for no reason? Now you might say, well, Leo, atoms exist for some reason. We just don't know the reason. Yeah, okay, but in the end, you have to, like, no matter how rigorously you do your science, at the end of all your science, you're going to accept something for nothing. You're going to accept that it all came from somewhere for some unknown reason. You have to. Right? But that's going to be a double standard because you're not going to grant that same kind of logic to a theist or to a Bigfoot believer. Don't assume that God is unnecessary because we have evolution. It's like, well, Leo, we figured out evolution. We know that works, so why do we need God? Don't assume that science and mathematics could be done without God. It's a very common assumption. The assumption that the limits inside the universe apply to reality itself. For example, just because we have physical laws in our universe, then those physical laws would apply to something beyond the universe. Don't assume that. A common assumption is that nothing can be known for sure. Like this kind of logic that like, well, Leo, science doesn't know anything for sure anyways. Science is just a bunch of probabilities and we're just kind of, we're putting theories out there and we're predicting stuff, but we can never be absolutely sure about anything. Science never proves anything 100%. If you believe that, then you just don't understand how science works. And then this kind of logic is used to say that nothing can be known absolutely. And what I'm saying is that even though science might work the way you're saying, but I'm saying that you're still assuming that nothing can be known absolutely. Just because science works that way doesn't mean that nothing can be known absolutely. These are unrelated claims. Both can be true. Another assumption is that there can be no such thing as absolute truths. That's a common one that scientists will resort to when backed into a corner. Another common assumption is that absolute truth, even if it does exist, cannot be known for certain because, after all, we're just chimpanzees who evolved on this planet, and our brains are just not sufficient to know such things. Another assumption is that there is a veil of perception. Perception is always mediating our contact with the world and our brain, our neurology. So we can never see beyond the veil of perception to see what the external world is really like. So Leo, we shouldn't be making any kind of grand absolute truth claims because, after all, anything we conclude, all of science, even mathematics and logic and all that, in the end is just monkey brain stuff that we're doing. And we have no idea whether it is connected to the external world in any way whatsoever. And it probably isn't. That's an assumption. Another assumption is that reality works from the bottom up, not from the top down. So like everything is built up out of atoms and so on, rather than, for example, top down. What would top down look like? Top down would look like the universe is dreaming up your entire life and the atoms within it as one whole. There's no such thing as a universe made of atoms. It's really just your life being dreamed downwards. That's a possibility. So be open to that possibility. Another assumption is that all of reality can be reduced down to atoms, quantum field equations, and mathematics. That's an assumption. You don't know if that's correct, is my point. Another common assumption is that solipsism is false and ridiculous. Obviously, right? Obviously, solipsism can't be true. Another assumption is that reality itself must be dumb. It cannot be sentient. It cannot be conscious. It cannot be alive. It cannot be intelligent. Like Leo, to say that the universe is alive and sentient, that's absurd. That's some woo nonsense. No, don't assume that. You don't know. Another assumption is that reality is finite. You don't know that. Another assumption commonly is that death is real and that death is not a subjective matter of perspective. Another assumption is that there's no way that science, atheism, rationalism, and skepticism can themselves be self-deceptions. Another assumption is that how you think about reality does not change reality. But what if it does? What if there's no such thing as reality independent of your mind? Don't assume that. Another assumption is that there are crisp, distinct physical objects out there, just given objects. For example, the world is just filled with cats and trees and apples and dogs and humans and planets and moons. But what if all those objects are in some way constructed by the mind? Another assumption is sanity. You're assuming that reality fits within sanity. What if it doesn't? What if to truly understand reality, you'd have to go insane? Don't assume. Another assumption is that the human mind is even capable of understanding God. What if it isn't? That doesn't mean God doesn't exist. It means that you're just incapable of it, of understanding it. That's a possibility. Another assumption is that everything true can be communicated. Another assumption is that everything true has an explanation or a definition. Another assumption is that there's a difference between hallucinations and reality. See, before when we were talking about like, oh, well, what if the ghost you saw is just hallucination? Yeah, what if the difference you're imagining between hallucinations and reality, what if that is a hallucination? See, you want to get real skeptical? Another assumption is that religious people don't know. No, let me skip that one. I'm going to skip that one. I don't like that one. Next one is another assumption is that there are some things that are impossible for reality. Like, for example, it's impossible for reality to be infinitely intelligent. That's impossible. But how do you know? Why would that be possible? Well, Leo, because how could that be possible? It doesn't fit with the laws of physics. Do you really know the laws of physics well enough to know that that's impossible? Or is that just an assumption? Another assumption is that the validity of science contradicts the existence of God. Like Leo, if God exists, that means science can't be real. No, maybe there's a way to reconcile both. Maybe both can be true in some sense. Another assumption is that if one God is possible, then any number of gods can be possible. That kind of atheist argument, like Leo, why don't you believe in Zeus and in, the Egyptian gods and so forth? Well, but that assumes that there can be multiple gods. Don't assume that. Maybe there's an important reason why there's only one God and not multiple. Another assumption is that if God exists, then science would apply to God, like the laws of physics would apply to God. Don't assume that. Another assumption is that consciousness and intelligence are biological processes happening inside of a brain. Don't assume that. Another assumption is that reality cannot be God. God is something other than reality. Another assumption is that you cannot be God because God is, after all, how could I be God? I'm just a human. God has to be something beyond me. So those are some of the common assumptions of this kind of scientific, rationalist, atheist worldview. Notice how much is being assumed there. That's where self-deception happens, is the more of this kind of stuff you assume, the less capable you are of truly interfacing with reality and taking it as it is, right? The whole game here is that the mind is not open to just taking reality as it is. It has all sorts of mental ideas and preconceived notions about how it has to be. And then the more you think reality has to be a certain way, the less you're able to just take in reality as it is. And I'm going to claim here, this can get so bad, you can have so much of this mental baggage that God could appear before you and you wouldn't recognize it. Because your mental baggage affects how you're interpreting and seeing reality. Now you might say, well, Leo, yeah, sure, of course we have some mental baggage, but it can't be as bad as you're saying. Like, surely if God really did appear before me, surely my mental baggage wouldn't deny it. No, don't assume that. Not surely. I'm willing to bet you would deny it. I'm willing to bet you would claim that you had a hallucination, and I'm willing to bet that you would say that you lost your mind, that you went insane. And I'm willing to bet that you would check yourself into a mental institution and get antipsychotic medication before you actually admitted that you experienced God. That's actually, when the atheist says that, they're actually being pretty honest. That is how most people would react to an actual direct confrontation with God. And this is not just hypothetical. We have mental institutions that are filled with people like this, people who check themselves into mental institutions. Today, hundreds of human beings around the planet today have checked themselves into a mental institution because they had an experience of God, but to them, that's so crazy and implausible that they think they lost their mind, and they would prefer to instead take antipsychotic medication. That happened hundreds of times today. So, moving on now, more points about why proof is limited. So one reason that proof is limited is because even a perfectly valid and rigorous proof can fail to convince you. Notice a distinction between the validity of a proof and its persuasive power. Now, usually this distinction is not noticed, for example, in the field of mathematics, because in mathematics, you're dealing with abstract numbers and theorems that have very little impact on your direct survival or your ego. Unless you're like particularly attached to some mathematical theorem, there's very little consequence to your everyday life and to your ego, so there's no threat with mathematical proofs. When you're reading a mathematical proof, it's not like you're going to be reading it, and then, oh my God, and you have an existential crisis. No, there's not anything that's shocking within mathematics. Although the case could be made that there are, like if you go really deep into mathematics, there are some shocking things like that, like some of the Girdles and completeness proofs and so forth. But generally speaking, that's not a serious risk. But when we're talking about core elements of what you think reality is and how you should live your life, right? Because see, to admit the existence of God has very serious repercussions beyond a mathematical proof, you see? So there's very good reasons why you would deny the existence of God, because it could be very inconvenient to your life. Imagine that you're just like one of these sort of like degenerate pickup artists who sleeps around with women, gambles, professional gambler, drinks, does drugs, parties, lives this kind of narcissistic, hedonistic lifestyle. He scams people, this sort of stuff. And then he has an encounter with God, right? Is he going to want to admit that it was a genuine encounter with God? No, of course not, because that would be so inconvenient it would be so threatening to the way that he's living his life, because he might need to reform. He might need to stop cheating, lying, stealing, scamming, doing drugs, if God is real. So even though we might present him with a perfectly logical, valid proof of God. He might not accept it because it's just inconvenient for his ego, and the ego is involved. The ego is the gatekeeper. The ego controls how open-minded someone is. Most people, you will notice, are very closed-minded. They're dogmatic. They have emotional attachments, and they are lost in a fever dream of survival. They don't care about God. They don't care about truth. They don't care about logic and proof. What they care about is just survival. They care about sex and money and fame and success. And how is God going to help with any of that? So whether a proof convinces you is very subjective and relative. I want you to notice that. Another important point here is that logical syllogisms and arguments always require valid premises. So this is the fatal flaw in all deductive logic. You can follow all the formal rules of logic, modus ponens and all that kind of stuff. But remember, and this is something that they don't stress enough in logic class, is that all of your logic is null and void in terms of understanding reality, because logical proofs always require premises to get them off the ground. And the problem is that we can't agree on the premises. And most of the premises are not self-evident. Or if they are self-evident, people disagree about which ones are more self-evident than others. And people can have opposite ideas about what is and isn't self-evident. To some people, God is self-evident. To other people, God is the opposite of self-evident. Who's right? Logic can't tell us what is self-evident and what isn't. So again, people misuse logic, thinking that logic somehow is going to save them from these kind of value judgments and subjectivity and relativity. Logic can't save you from that because it all hinges on premises. And ultimately, all your premises must ground in experience. What do I mean by premises? For example, Socrates is a man. All men are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That's a classic syllogistic, logical sort of argument. But notice, Socrates is a man. What if Socrates is not a man? Leo, but he is a man. Well, it seems that way, doesn't it? But let's be really skeptical. What if it seems that Socrates is a man, but actually he's not a man? Wow, that's an interesting possibility. See? Now all your logic flew out the window. Where's your argument now? Is Socrates mortal now? The next one is like, all men are mortal. Really? How do you know that? What if there's a man who's immortal? Have you met all men? How do you know? Again, you're assuming. Another point here is that notice that it's impossible to do away with experience. All knowledge ultimately grounds in experience. Purely analytic and a priori truth is a myth. They like to talk about it within philosophy, but it doesn't really exist. Even what are considered classical analytic truths, such as, so the best analytic truth might be something like, all bachelors are unmarried men. That's true analytically by virtue just of definitions of those words. A bachelor is by definition an unmarried man, so all bachelors must be unmarried men, because if they were married, then they wouldn't be bachelors. That's sort of tautological. The problem is that even with truths like that, you still need experience, the experience of having lived in the world and seen that the world is logical, right? It's not even obvious that the world is logical until you've lived in it and you've seen it be logical. For example, we could imagine a world where you have an apple sitting on the table and then it just spontaneously turns into a teapot, and then it spontaneously turns into a piece of cheese, and then it spontaneously turns into a vase of flowers, just because that's how the universe is constructed. objects just spontaneously pop in and out and change and morph. We could live in a sort of illogical universe like that. We don't, right? Our logic tells us, or our experience of the world tells us that things do in fact operate in a logical way. And what I'm claiming is that the only reason that seems obvious and sort of analytic and a priori is because you're taking for granted your own experience. And in fact, a lot of these things are not even that obvious. The notion of object permanence, for example. Babies do not have object permanence. It takes them a while before their nervous system develops a sense of object permanence, which just shows you that even something like object permanence should not be taken for granted as obvious and given. So the bottom line is that you cannot know anything a priori without consciousness. And that's the key. So now we're getting into some really deep territory here when we're going to start talking about consciousness. Because there's a deep connection between consciousness and God, which is taken for granted and overlooked. So my point is that even for you to recognize an analytic truth, even more fundamentally than you need experience of the world to see its consistency and its logicality, even more fundamental than that, you need to be conscious. You can't understand an analytic truth without being conscious. And the clearest evidence of this is that an animal like a dog does not understand very basic analytic truths. A dog does not understand that all bachelors are unmarried men. Why not? Because it's not conscious enough. And that, as kind of like obvious and simple as that sounds, that turns out to be the crucial point on which this entire God-proof business hinges. Because God requires consciousness. Understanding God requires consciousness. But we'll get to that in a minute. A few more points here about why proof is limited. Proof and argument are second-order phenomena. Understand this. What does this mean? This means that proof is not just like a simple primitive that you find in the world. Proof is something humans have constructed using language, thought, mind, concepts, and models. You need all that to construct any kind of proof of anything. Whereas we might say, for example, an apple sitting on the table, that's just a fact of the world. There's no, it's so fundamental, it's just, we would call that first order. An apple sitting on the table is first order. Then what you're thinking about that apple, your proofs, you might then, the apple is sitting there, and then you can sit and you can do a second order conceptual analysis of the apple, and you could say, well, maybe the apple is just a mirage. It's not real. Maybe it's a hologram. Maybe the apple is just a simulation. Maybe this is all a simulation in a computer. Or maybe the apple is not what it appears to be. Maybe it's a plastic apple and not a real apple. Maybe it's just a painting of an apple that's just so photorealistic that I'm thinking it's a real apple, but it's not. It's just a 2D image. So, see, that's all second-order stuff that's being done on just the apple sitting on the table. The problem, though, is that when you're in the conceptual domain, the entire conceptual domain of mind is second order. It's derivative of the first order, which is just your baseline sense of experience. Your experience of this room that you're sitting in, wherever you are, that's first order. Second order is all of your thoughts about it. Also notice that second order is science. All of science is second order. It's not first order, because science requires language, thoughts, activation of mind, concepts, models, mental imagery, going out there manipulating stuff, coming up with conclusions, doing interpretations, doing error correction, accounting for noise and anomalies, arguing with other people, other scientists about the results, how to interpret the results, developing a consensus. This is all second order. The phenomenon that you're studying, like let's say you're studying the moon, that's first order. The moon is there. what the moon means, how the moon works, how we model the moon, how we talk about the moon, our consensus about the moon, that's all second order stuff. And so proof and argument is all second order stuff. But the assumption when we're talking about proving God is that something second order, something conceptual, can reach down below itself to the ultimate substrate of existence. That turns out to be a very shaky assumption. Why are you assuming that a conceptual scheme of the mind can reach down into ultimate existence itself? As it turns out, God is an absolute. Absolute is not a concept. God is so real that it's more real than the first order of human experience. So how do you reach to it, right? Science even struggles to reach to the first order of normal everyday human experience using second order. For example, science cannot grasp what colors are very well because colors are first order and science deals with second order. Usually this is not a problem for science because science doesn't need to know what colors are per se. It can model colors, sure. You could say that colors are just wavelengths and blah, 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 but that doesn't really get you to the first order of color. So there's a fundamental disconnect between the second and first order. And likewise, I'm going to imply that there's even a deeper disconnect between the second order and the sort of zero order, which is more fundamental than the first order, which is the absolute. Stop assuming that you can use second order stuff to reach to the first order or even below that. After all, look, proof is an experience. Any kind of proof you generate, whether it's a good proof or a bad proof, it is happening within experience. So for your proof to function, whether your proof succeeds or does not succeed, in order for your proof to exist at all, it has to exist as an experience. So how can a proof that exists reach down and grasp the nature of existence itself? Because the proof has to exist first before it can grasp anything. So our difficulty here is that when we're talking about proving God, we're talking about grasping the ultimate nature of existence. How do you do that with concepts? Don't assume that that's possible. In fact, it is not possible. However, also don't assume that just because concepts are not up to the job, that now we're stuck and that's as far as we can go. This is where scientists make the common mistake, is that they assume that. It's like, well, yeah, Leo, science can only take us so far. And then beyond that, it's like, who knows? Let's not waste our time on it. No, let's not make the assumption that we're wasting our time. And let's not make the assumption that there's no other way. There could be another way, and there is another way, which is why we're talking about it. If there was no other way, we would be talking about this stuff. So another point here about the limitation of proof is that proof involves social consensus. See, what good is a proof if I'm the only one who believes the proof? I could come up with a proof for God, but then only I believe it and nobody else believes it. Is that proof going to be convincing to anybody? No. The point of a proof is that you get the buy-in of your community. But you see, once you start to deal with a community of people and getting their buy-in, that's a very slippery, deceptive, subjective, group-thinky sort of problem, right? Now you need to convince everybody in your community and in your tribe to accept this proof. But that assumes communicability. To get a consensus, you need to be able to communicate your proof effectively to everybody else. It also assumes that they have enough intelligence to grasp what you're trying to communicate to them. It's possible, for example, if you go trying to communicate Einstein's general relativity to a group of baboons, you're not going to get very far in convincing them and developing a social consensus amongst your baboon friends. And I'm not just using that as an insult. I'm talking about literal baboons. You see, why can't you convince a group of baboons to agree on general relativity? Because they don't have enough consciousness and intelligence to even understand what the hell you're talking about. And that turns out to be a very significant point. You don't want to assume that the general population or even the scientific community has enough intelligence to grasp God. Also notice what social consensus assumes. Social consensus assumes that other minds are real and that the entire social domain has a reality to it and a importance and validity to it. Don't assume that. Here's a thought experiment for you. Imagine that absolute solipsism was true, that you are the only mind in existence. Now, my question to you is, how do you prove that? So just assuming that it's true, but then the question is, how do you prove it? Pause and really think through this thought experiment until you realize that if solipsism was true, you couldn't prove it to anybody else. You could only grasp it for yourself because you're the only one. And so there couldn't be a social consensus proof of solipsism. It would just have to be you realizing that it's you. That's it. Now, a scientist would come and say, well, but where's the proof? Where is the objective third-person proof of solipsism? And of course, this already shows the cluelessness of the scientist, because what solipsism is so fundamentally profound that you can't even use the regular scientific methods that are taken for granted to realize it or to understand or to prove it. That's how fundamental, how existential solipsism is if it's true. Now, I'm not saying it's true. I'm just throwing it out there as a thought experiment, which just goes to show that the ultimate structure and nature of existence could be such that our conventional social methods that we use to understand the ordinary world are not going to apply. So, for example, ordinarily we would say, like, is the moon real? Does the moon exist? We could get 100 of our friends to come out at night and look at the moon, and all of them would agree, yeah, the moon exists. We could ask them all to take a photograph of the moon. We could line up all the photographs into a matrix of 100 photographs, and all of them have the moon, and they all look roughly the same. And we could say, therefore, that's proof that the moon exists and is real. That works for stuff like a moon. It does not work for something more fundamental and existential like, for example, solipsism. And it's also not going to work for God. Notice this limitation of all methods. Any method that you're using to understand reality, notice this. Just because that method works in certain domains and gets you certain results and success, it does not follow from that it works across all domains for all things. As the saying goes, what got you here won't get you there. To discover deeper and higher aspects of reality requires new ways, new methods, because every method is limited. You need to be open to the possibility that there exist aspects of reality which are more fundamental than your method, which your method cannot reach. So you want to be careful about limiting yourself with your own method. Another very important point is that you need to acknowledge that there exist things in the universe that are true but cannot be proven. This is the notion that I call truth is larger than proof as concepts. The concept of proof is a larger thing, is a superset of proof. Truth is larger than proof, right? I might have misspoken, I don't know. I might have gotten those confused, right? So the way that it works is that truth is the entire domain of factual stuff, let's say, in the universe. That's true. That's the whole set of the entire universe. That's truth. And then which of those you could actually prove is always going to be a subset, something smaller than the entire set. This is actually a rather technical point and argument. This can be rigorously logically proven. This is what Girdle's incompleteness theorems are about. If you want more on that, I have some older episodes called Girdle's incompleteness theorem, part 1. I have another one called What is Paradox, which is a part 2 to that episode, where we discuss this issue in great detail and why it is true that truth is larger than proof. So Kurt Girdle formally proved within logic and mathematics that there exists mathematical and logical truths which are true but are impossible to prove. And he proved that. So it's very twisted, very strange, loopy, and fascinating. So if you want to learn more about that, go study the implications of Girdle's incompleteness theorems. I'm not going to go into that too deeply here, other than just to point out that this is an important point, because many rationalists and scientists simplistically assume that just because something is true, that it can always be proven. This is, of course, false. And you can just kind of like simplistically understand this without having to go through any kind of, crazy formal Gödelian proof. Just look at it like this. Imagine that you saw a ghost or got abducted by aliens one night. Does that prove that they exist? From your point of view, of course, if the aliens abducted you, you know that they exist. There's no doubt about that. Now, you might say, well, I was having a mental break. Again, you could say that about anything. That's the problem with that line of argument. But assuming that you're not going to go there, you really feel like you saw the aliens, they abducted you, you experienced it. You know that aliens exist, but that doesn't mean you're going to be able to prove it to anybody else. If the aliens drop you back down to Earth and fly away, who are you going to prove it to? Who's going to believe you? Nobody's going to believe you. You're not going to be able to prove to anybody that this happened to you. Whether you can prove it or not is always going to be, in the base case scenario, you're going to have some kind of proof. Maybe you grab an alien tool or something off their ship. That could be proof. But you could always fail to do so, and then you won't have proof, right? Think about it like this. There are many people who have gotten murdered, sort of like, criminal investigations. There are always going to be more people who got murdered than your ability to prove who did the murdering. Isn't that obvious to you that it must always be this way? You're never going to have the case where every murder is always going to have a proof for who the murderer is, because you can always have a scenario where somebody did a murder so surreptitiously that there's just not going to be any physical evidence of it. You're not going to find blood splatter. You're not going to find hair samples. You're not going to find DNA. You're not going to have photographic evidence. To have any of this kind of evidence, you have to be pretty lucky. Nothing in the universe guarantees that you have a right to know, in all cases, who the murderer is of every murder. So that's basically what this means, that truth is larger than proof. Truth, in this case, is all the murders, and proof is all the murders that you can prove or have evidence for. So just because you can't prove to other human beings that you were abducted by aliens, does that mean aliens don't exist? No, it just means you can't prove it. So it's very common sense stuff here, but even though everything I'm saying is pretty common sense, you'll be amazed at how often very scientifically minded people don't get these basic points. Here's another thought experiment for you. Imagine you're born blind. How would you prove to yourself that colors exist? Think about that. Very interesting, because if you were very skeptical, everybody around you would be talking about colors, how beautiful things are, how colorful things look, but you're completely blind. You have no notion of what a color even is. As far as you're concerned, they could be just playing some cruel prank on you. They could be lying. They could be deluded. Maybe you're living amongst a bunch of insane people who think that colors exist when they really don't. How would you, as a blind person, know? So what this shows is that I'd like you to recognize that there are things that are so fundamental about existence and reality that they are prior to argumentation. Not everything can be argued for. Here's another example for you. Here's a list of examples of things that basically can't be argued for. Prove that orgasms exist. That's not as easy as it seems, and don't misunderstand what I'm saying, because a scientist here will come up and say, oh, well, Leo, of course we can prove orgasms exist. Just put someone in an MRI scanner and you'll know when they have an orgasm, you'll see it on the scanner. No, you're not understanding what I mean. I mean the experience of an orgasm. Prove that it exists. How do you even know what an orgasm is? When I say that word, how do you even know what I'm talking about? How do you know that I'm not just making it up? How do you know that I'm not hallucinating or that I'm not insane when I say that I've had orgasms? Imagine somebody who's incapable of ever having an orgasm. How would they make sense of what an orgasm is? How would they know that everybody who's talking about orgasms isn't just insane? You see? So God is like an orgasm, which is why you can't prove it. You need to have it. And when you have it, it's completely obvious, just like an orgasm is. Nobody is doubting their orgasms. When you're in the middle of an orgasm, you're not sitting there as a skeptic and like, maybe I'm having a mental breakdown. No. You know exactly what you're having. You're having an orgasm. And see, again, this is where I mean the double standards. The errors, the epistemic errors that come with the double standards. I have a whole episode about hypocrisy and double standards. Go see that. No scientist doubts orgasms. No atheist doubts orgasms. But they do doubt experiences of God. And what I would submit is that that's a double standard. That's an unfair double standard. It's a self-deceptive double standard. And that the atheist and the scientist is actually not aware that their mind is playing this trick. Now, of course, they're going to say something like, well, Leo, but you can't compare experiences of God to orgasms. It's not the same thing. What if they are the same thing? By which I mean they're the same thing epistemologically, ontologically. Here's another thing that you can't quite argue your way through, which is prove that your memories are real. So you claim that you were born in a certain place and you went to school and you had friends. Prove to me that you actually went to school. Well, Leo, of course I did. I have memories. Prove it to me. How do I know you're not insane? Well, Leo, I have photographs. Really? Right now in front of you, you have photographs of you going to school? No, you don't. You have a memory. You have a memory of photographs. Again, see, there's an illusion that you're rigorous. You're not rigorous. I'm more rigorous than you because you think you have photographs of going to school. And I'm conscious enough to understand that you don't have photographs. You have memories of photographs. No, Leo, I can go on my phone and I can find photographs of me in school. That's a memory you have that you can go on your phone. You even have a memory of your phone. You're not even conscious enough to understand that your phone is a memory right now. Unless you're watching me on your phone, which is an interesting twist on this problem. Many of you probably are watching me on your phone. So in that sense, yes, you have your phone there and it's not a memory. But then your computer is a memory. Something else is a memory. A lot more of what you think is real is just a memory than what you believe it is. Most of your life is composed of memories. See, even as a scientist, you're sitting there, unless you're literally sitting in your laboratory. Let's say you're at home relaxing from a full days of work. And you say, well, Leo, I'm a very rigorous scientist. And what I'm telling you is that you cannot even prove to me that you're a scientist. Because your memory of having been a scientist your whole life, you can't even prove that's real. That's how shaky science is. Now you're going to say, oh, Leo, that's ridiculous. Now you're just being ridiculous. No, I'm being rigorous and you're not. I'm doing serious philosophy and you are copping out and you're tapping out because you don't want to do real philosophy. You just want to reinforce your existing view of reality. And if you go with me on this philosophical journey, what you'll realize is that your whole sense of reality will melt before your eyes and you'll be left with nothing. And that's exactly what you're resisting. So there's always a, what's it called? There's always an ulterior motive here from your mind that you don't even recognize, which is that you're trying to desperately hold on to your sense of reality. And I'm always trying to desperately undermine it. Did you see the game that was being played here? That's the metagame. How about this one? Prove to me that the universe didn't start 5 seconds ago with everything just exactly where it is right, now. You think science is on solid footing? Science can't even prove the universe didn't start 5 seconds ago. Impossible to prove that. Prove that we're not in a simulation. You can't prove that. Prove to me that you are not a philosophical zombie. You can't prove that. Prove to me that scientific method is valid. You can't prove that. If you want to know more about why you can't prove that, and if you think you can prove that, go see my episode series called Deconstructing the Myth of Science. Prove to me that your reasoning faculties are not faulty. See, as you're sitting there doing your skepticism, doing your science, doing your rationality, how do you know there's not a defect in your brain that makes you think that you're being logical, but actually you aren't? Prove that. And lastly, prove to yourself that you exist. How do you prove that you exist? What if you're just hallucinating? What if you're just insane? What if you're mistaken about your own existence? So think about that. This is you can spend months thinking about this. I'm giving you so much food for thought here. Moving on to the next fundamental point about the limitations of proof. Okay, this is a huge one, right? Look at this. Look at the genius of this. Logical proof requires intelligence, intuition, and consciousness, without which there can be no proof of anything whatsoever. I'm saying that you could not even prove that 1 + 1 = 2 if you did not have sufficient intelligence. This is true. Check for yourself. Try to get a baboon to understand that 1 + 1 = 2. They won't understand it because they don't have the intelligence. So what this means is that if your intelligence is too low, there will be proofs which are true, but you cannot grasp. So all of science, all of mathematics, and all of logic hinges upon the core assumption that everybody who's engaged in the collective social project of doing science, logic, mathematics has the same rough level of intelligence that is able to grasp pretty much the same sort of stuff. So for example, a proof of the Pythagorean theorem is considered a proof because it is assumed that everybody involved in this domain and in this study has enough intelligence to grasp the proof. But what if you're dealing with a mentally retarded person? Well, all of a sudden, they can't grasp it. The next point of this is that just because something is true doesn't mean your mind is able to grasp it. That's a huge assumption. So generally, atheists and scientists and rationalists will just assume that anything that's sort of controversial and true, my mind should just be able to grasp it because I'm this big-brained atheist. No, you're basically a baboon, so don't assume that you're going to grasp what I'm saying. The things that I teach and say are so advanced in intelligence that 99.9% of human beings will never be able to grasp it because I'm more intelligent than you. That sounds like obnoxious to say, but like I'm saying it in this very specific context where I'm trying to demonstrate to you the importance of intelligence. And also notice that there's going to be a very relativistic notion to intelligence because, of course, you're going to dispute that I'm more intelligent than you. You're going to want to say, no, Leo, you're full of shit. I'm more intelligent than Leo. That's what you're going to want to say. And then the question is, well, which one of us is more intelligent, actually? The chances that you and I are equally intelligent is rather unlikely, pretty low. One of us is going to be more intelligent. How do we determine that? See, this already is a very complicated relativistic problem because, of course, my ego wants to say that I'm more intelligent than you because if I'm more intelligent than you, that means that my worldview trumps your worldview because it's more accurate, more intelligent. Whereas if you're more intelligent than me, then you get to trump your worldview gets to trump my worldview. So, of course, everybody wants to assume that they're the most intelligent relative to everybody else because they want to preserve their worldview, right? Does Alex Jones want to admit that he has a lower intelligence than most people? No, because if he admits that, then his whole worldview of conspiracy theories is rendered moot and obsolete. So whenever we're arguing about reality, the question of intelligence becomes central. And how do you determine who has the higher intelligence? That's very non-obvious. First of all, that assumes that there is such a thing as just a linear measure of intelligence that can be quantified, like IQ. IQ is a very problematic metric. Intelligence is not as simple as a number. And it's also not the case that just because someone is more intelligent, that they're always right. I could be more intelligent than you, but my worldview could just be more diluted than yours for all sorts of other reasons, just because of the way I was raised, the where I went to school. You might have gone to a better school than me, even though your intelligence is lower. And many, many other such factors, right? I might be more corrupt. I might be more biased. I might have more conflicts of interest than you. So even with a higher intelligence, I could be more deluded than you. And even more than that, even deeper problem is that don't assume that just because someone has a higher intelligence that they're always more accurate or more truthful. In fact, many highly intelligent people are very effective liars, sociopaths, and manipulators. They may not care about the truth at all. And there could even be a further problem of that. The more intelligent you get, it doesn't necessarily always mean that your worldview is going to be more accurate because there are certain traps and mistakes that the mind can fall into only when it reaches a certain level of intelligence. Simple-minded people are actually not intelligent enough to fool themselves as deeply as high IQ people. So it's very counterintuitive. It's not some sort of simple linear relationship. But generally speaking, the more intelligent you are, the more you're able to grasp difficult truths. So scientific method assumes intelligence. And it assumes recognition. when you're sitting there going through a Pythagorean theorem, all the steps, it takes a lot of intelligence for the mind to connect all the dots and then to grasp in its mental imagery, to grasp like, aha, oh, I see. Yeah, the hypotenuse and this is related, and a squared, b squared, c squared. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, of course, it makes perfect sense, right? But that's a very mysterious thing that's going on, requiring intuition, not just intelligence, but intuition. So intuition is also taken for granted. There has to be an intuitive recognition of a certain set of facts, combining all the dots together into a holistic understanding. That's what intelligence is. That's what intuition is. Insight needs to happen. Go see my episode, What is Insight? And so to have this kind of recognition of a Pythagorean theorem or anything really requires consciousness. The higher your consciousness, the more complex of a Pythagorean theorem, so to speak, you'll be able to understand. Now, consider this possibility. There exist things analogous to Pythagorean theorems which are so complex and so sophisticated, requiring such a high intelligence that no human being on this planet can understand it. So open your mind to that possibility. Now, if such a thing exists, how would you prove it to mankind? Because mankind does not have enough intelligence to grasp it. Does that mean that it's not true? No, it just means mankind doesn't have enough intelligence, doesn't have enough consciousness. So notice this core assumption here. When we're talking about proving God to you, this assumes that you're intelligent enough to recognize God. For example, if you're a rather dim skeptic, you will misuse skepticism because you're not aware of its potential traps, limitations, and deceptions, and you will you will convince yourself that the thing you saw as which was actually God wasn't God, it was a mental break. That would be an example of low intelligence not being able to recognize God. In the same way that if we took a rather dim person with a very low IQ, maybe IQ of 70 or something, and we try to show him the Pythagorean theorem, because he's not intelligent, he's not going to have enough intelligence to see that all the parts of the theorem fit together perfectly and lead to a genuinely valid, conclusion that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And so instead, rather than admitting that he's dim, instead what he's going to do is he's going to say, oh, this Pythagorean theorem is just nonsense. It's just word salad. It's just a hallucination. It's just something, it's a fiction. It's some sort of new age fairy tale that you guys invented. There's no such thing as a Pythagorean theorem. But really, he just can't grasp it. Okay, the next really important point. This is so critical. Not all truths are accessible to every mind. Many truths are only accessible through deep personal transformation. There's a general assumption within science and skepticism and rationalism that anything true is just accessible to anybody, as long as they're able to just do a little bit of work to read a little bit of material and then they'll understand it. No, that's not how it works. There exist stages of cognitive and ego development. I've covered these stages in prior episodes. There are many stages of cognitive and ego development, and each of these stages is so significant and such a radical shift in how you interface and understand reality that there are things that you can see within higher stages, that you cannot see from the lower stages. It's like you're accessing higher dimensions of reality. Once you understand this, you understand that really profound existential truths are not about believing in a set of propositions like snow is white, the sun exists, the moon exists, and God exists. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a deep penetration of existence with your mind. This is a being level participatory knowing. It is not propositional. You're not just believing a statement or saying that something is true or false simplistically. Like, oh, God exists or God does not exist. I just believe it. Okay, good. We're done. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about comprehending reality in profound ways. So what atheists misunderstand about spirituality is that spirituality is not about a belief in God. That's a stupid form of spirituality. Spirituality is about upgrading your consciousness and your mind, the machinery of your mind, upgrading that so that you can see deeper into the ultimate nature of reality. If you assume that all of spirituality is just woo bullshit, then you won't do the work to transform yourself to be able to see spiritual phenomena. It's not that spiritual phenomena is mystical and imaginary and superstition. It's that you haven't done the work to develop your mind to be able to see it. You're kind of like a deaf person at a music concert. A music concert does not make sense if you're deaf. It seems like insanity. Why are people sitting there? What are they looking at? What are they doing? Why are they playing these instruments, these violins and things, when there's no sound? What's the point? It's insanity. Yes, it is, when you're blind or deaf to the music. So an atheist is someone who's blind to spiritual phenomena. That's literally what it is. The problem, though, is that an atheist is not intelligent enough to understand that. And so instead, what they do is they come up with an excuse or an elaborate worldview to explain why, no, Leo, us atheists, we're not blind and deaf. It's just that we're like the really scientific ones, and you're just talking about unicorns and fantasies. So here's my question to you is, how do you get a person like that to do all of the years of work they need to do to upgrade their mind and to become more intelligent and to develop the psychological machinery necessary to, first of all, admit that they're wrong? That's going to be a huge ego hit for them. They're going to have to admit that they're wrong, and then they're going to have to do all that meditation work, psychedelic work, psychotherapy work, ego development work for decades before they have their first spiritual experience. And not just dismiss it as a hallucination. See? Because an atheist can have a spiritual experience, but he'll dismiss it. And he'll couch it back into his materialist framework. He'll just say, oh, that's just the chemicals in the brain, man. So the problem there is a lack of intelligence. Because the atheist is not intelligent enough to see how his own mind is tricking him into believing that this is just a chemical experience in his brain. It takes an enormous amount of intelligence to realize that the brain could be itself a hallucination. So this is, we're getting into the very profound machinery of self-deception. This is what I'm an expert in, is understanding this machinery and explaining it. You're not going to find anywhere online anybody who explains self-deception more precisely and accurately and more comprehensively than I do, because I devoted my entire life to studying this stuff. I know self-deception like a chess grandmaster knows chess and looks at a newbie. So when I see a skeptic or an atheist playing, it's like I'm Magnus Carlsen and I'm looking at some newbie playing chess. I can see every single mistake he's making from a mile away. He doesn't even understand what he's doing. And to me, it's so easy that it's like I'm just like looking with an X-ray and I can just see every single mistake that the mind is making. And why do I have this capacity? Because I spent 3 decades of my life doing this for myself. That's what's necessary if you want to understand God. See, the assumption that the atheist has is that I can just give him a few sentences and then that whether God exists or doesn't exist, and that'll be enough for him to understand and be done with this issue. This is a delusional, cartoonishly childish view of existence. This utterly underestimates the complexity of epistemology and ontology. To understand the ultimate source of existence is the most complicated and intelligent feat of the mind. This is something that one in millions of human beings has the intelligence to do. Nobody appreciates that. Scientists just assume, well, but Leo, I have enough intelligence to do my science. I got a PhD, so I'm intelligent, right? So what's the problem? No, you're underestimating the scale of intelligence. A human being with a PhD, relative to the scale of the universe's intelligence, is closer to a baboon than to what is necessary to understand what I'm talking about. Just the idea that you think a PhD proves that you have intelligence, this already proves how unintelligent you are. You're completely underestimating the scope of what we're talking about. We're talking about an intelligence that is so vast that it's able to construct the entire universe. How do you understand an intelligence that vast? Only by rising to its level, because it's not going to descend down to your level. The next point, God is not an object found inside the universe. God is not a thing. God is an infinite field in which all finite things arise as appearance. I'm giving you now a very technical, rigorous definition of God. Because up to this point, it's like, well, God, what does God really mean? I just told you what it means. God is an infinite field in which all finite things arise as appearance. That's what it is. Are you intelligent enough to understand what I just said? Are you intelligent enough to connect the dots and to see that this is the infinite field that I'm talking about? What am I talking about? I'm talking about this field that you are. So God is this field, but it's more complicated than that. God is a recognition of this field. It's the field's ability to recognize itself. So, God, another way to say what God is the universe's recognition of itself as an infinite mind. When the universe, which is consciousness, increases its consciousness more and more and more until it recognizes what it is, which is an infinite mind, that moment of recognition is the moment of you proving God. But you're not proving God through logic to yourself or to anybody else, through social consensus, none of that shit. None of that is deep enough. What I'm saying is that the universe becomes so conscious that it understands what it really is. That's God. That's the proof of God. But it's not a conventional proof. It's not a logical proof, because this is more direct than logic. Logic can't go this deeply. God is a radical recontextualization of your present experience. God is not something that you find out there, and God is not a a spirit that appears before you. So when I say you have a direct experience of God, people imagine like Jesus appears before you glowing in white light, and then you see it and you bow before him and you have this religious experience. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something much more serious than that. I'm saying that God is when you realize and recontextualize this present experience that you're having right here as being an infinite mind. So this is a problem of recognition. You can't prove God to anybody because what's necessary is for them to recognize that they are God. This is analogous to the problem of having animals recognize themselves in the mirror. So most animals are not able to recognize their own reflection in the mirror. They're not able to grasp that, oh, that there is me. They're not able to do that. They don't have enough consciousness for it or intelligence. A human being is a little bit above an animal in consciousness and intelligence, so a human can grasp and make the connection, recognize himself in the mirror. Now imagine that there's a higher level. Animal, human, and then a third higher level. The higher level is when the entire universe recognizes itself as an infinite mind. And that is what God is. That needs to happen through you because you are the universe. And if it doesn't happen through you, if you don't recognize yourself in the mirror, there's no proof. You can't prove to a baboon that he's reflected in the mirror. There's no proof for that. That requires consciousness. That requires grasping. That requires intuition. It requires intelligence. And there's no way around that. Another way to put it is that God is a state of consciousness. So right now you are in consciousness. You are consciousness. You are this entire field of consciousness. And this field is in some kind of state. Your state changes. If you're drunk, your state will change. If you smoke some weed, your state will change. If you're sleepy, your state changes. If you're horny, your state changes. And if you're asleep or dreaming, your state changes. Or you're just normally kind of in normal waking consciousness. Here you are. That's your current state. Now, I say God is a state of consciousness, but be careful here because God is all states of consciousness. God is not a particular state. God is consciousness itself, which can take an infinite number of different states. But God realization is a particular degree of consciousness and a certain kind of state because not all states of consciousness recognize themselves. In the same way that not all animals recognize themselves in the mirror, not all humans recognize themselves as God, because there are higher and lower states. The lower your state, the less you're able to recognize of anything. The less you're able to self-reflect, the less intelligence you have. So intelligence is a function of consciousness, not your IQ, and not your brain size or any of that. So God is all possible states of consciousness, but to realize God, to have that moment of epiphany and grasping, that requires you enter into an elevated state of consciousness. How do you do that? You can do it through meditation. You can do it through psychedelics. You can do it through other kinds of spiritual practices, maybe chanting, prayer, whatever else. There are various different ways. It can even happen spontaneously. You could just be walking down the street and boom, your state of consciousness expands and you realize that you're God. And that's your proof. That's it. The realization of God is not just a mystical experience, it's a life-shattering event. That's another thing that atheists and scientists get wrong, is that they think that they can just realize God through some sort of conceptual academic endeavor, like learning a physics formula or something like that. No. This changes your whole life because your very being is involved. When you're learning a physics formula or an equation or a theory, your whole life, your being, your ego, it's not involved. It's not threatened. You don't need to develop your ego in order to understand Einstein's theory of relativity. Now, you do need to develop your mind because, like a high schooler is not going to have a sufficiently complex mind to understand general relativity. A college student can get there through work and do a lot of homework. You develop your mind, you develop your intellect. Great, but you don't need to develop your ego. With God realization, you have to develop your ego in addition to developing your intellect. And that's work that most human beings aren't doing because that's the most difficult work to do. Because most human beings are just in the business of protecting their ego. And remember, science is used and co-opted by the ego. So scientism, rationalism, atheism, skepticism, these get co-opted by the ego to create an ego identity. Once your ego is identified with all that stuff, good luck realizing God. Not going to happen. Even if you meditate, it's not going to happen. Great example, this is Sam Harris. Sam Harris is a very intelligent, PhD, very articulate guy. He also does a lot of meditation. He has a meditation app. He's done meditation retreats, but he doesn't understand God. Why? Because his whole identity is attached to this atheist, materialist, scientist, rationalist worldview. And the sophisticated self-deception dynamics that I'm talking about he's not intelligent enough to understand them. That's not an insult to him or to his intelligence. It's just showing you how high you have to go to really understand God. And this explains why nobody understands God and why people make all these stupid proofs and arguments about God. Because if someone even like a Sam Harris can't do it with all his meditation and all his study of spirituality, he's written books about spirituality. You would think he would get it. I mean, if all it took was just IQ and rationality, he's got plenty of that. Why doesn't he get it? Because there's much higher intelligence. There's also different kinds of intelligence too. So people can be intelligent in a certain aspect, but not intelligent in the necessary aspect. So to be really precise here, in order to grasp God, it's not enough just to be intelligent. For example, mathematical intelligence is not going to help you grasp God. And social intelligence will also not help you grasp God. And artistic intelligence is not going to help you. You need a very specific kind of intelligence, which is existential, metaphysical, epistemic intelligence, which is one of the rarest kinds of intelligences. That's my domain of expertise. So when I say I'm very intelligent, don't get me wrong, I don't mean across the board. There are many domains where I'm quite stupid. I'm not good at math. I don't have a high mathematical intelligence. I don't have a good, intelligence for physical, technical, like physics laboratory work, that kind of stuff. I don't have a super great social intelligence, but what I have is exceptional epistemic and ontological intelligence. And so that's why I'm in this position. Again, not to brag, I just want to be very clear to you with what the obstacles are and why people aren't getting it. So drop the assumption that God can just be understood. Just because you think you're intelligent, you went to university, you think you can understand God? No, don't assume that. See, it's not just that someone proves God to you or you have an experience of God. You become God. Grasping God requires becoming God. You have to unite and merge into God's intelligence. God has to grant you its intelligence so that you're able to recognize your own self. your whole mind and sense of reality has to implode. I just had someone on the forum write their story. They said that they were following my work for 10 years, and then they recently experienced a depersonalization derealization disorder. So what happened was that they were doing this work for so long and so deeply, they understood the epistemology and the ontology of the things that I'm talking about so deeply that their entire sense of reality melted. They had to check themselves into a mental institution. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I teach. This is what I'm teaching you. That's not a bug. That's a feature. See? So you're not going to get this just sitting in your armchair comfortably. Grasping God requires loss of self, loss of ego. When your ego dies, that is the proof you're looking for. Of course, you're going to experience that as terror, existential terror, and crisis. When your reality starts to melt, this is serious. But it's even harder than that, because realizing God it's not even enough to lose your ego to realize God. There are people who have lost their sense of self and still haven't realized God. To realize God requires going even higher into infinite consciousness, which is even harder than loss of self. Now you might wonder, well, Leo, how is recognition of God possible at all? Well, I'll tell you how, in the same way that anything can be understood at all. Get this. To understand anything at all requires consciousness. Nothing can ever be understood without consciousness, including science, math, logic, anything. You couldn't turn a doorknob without consciousness. So the way that anything is understood is through consciousness, and then if you want to understand more sophisticated and advanced things, you need more and more consciousness. Which, by the way, is why most people are not able to do science. They don't have enough intelligence and consciousness to do science. It takes quite a bit of intelligence to do science well, to do like groundbreaking research in science. But it goes way beyond that. See? So God is recognized when consciousness recognizes its own self. God can recognize God, and nothing else can. The only thing that can recognize God is you, because you're God. It's so solipsistic. God realization is so solipsistic, it's so absolute, that it has no exteriority to it. It has no other. It has no one to reassure you. One of the mistakes that scientists make is that they're always looking for some third-person objective validation of their theories, right? So if you're super skeptical, you've actually convinced yourself that the only way you can be sure of anything is if somebody else validates your work. So even as like a mathematician, you might do your proof, but then by going through the STEM education system, they taught you that you can't even trust your own proofs. Maybe you made a mistake. So you have to submit your proof to peer review, to your colleagues. They have to check it. And only after it goes through that whole process, you get it back and it clears all those checks. Only then can you finally surrender your own skepticism and say, oh, okay, fine. It passed all the peer review. I guess it must be true. After all, because, it's true for me, it's true for my colleagues, so that's as good as it gets. And ordinarily, this is a good process. It's good to have this kind of process, because without this, you can easily fall into self-deception. However, God realization is such a profound thing that it requires the mind to realize its own absoluteness. So God is absolute mind. The problem with absolute mind is that there's nothing beyond absolute mind because it's absolute. There's no other mind, and there's no external reality. There's literally another problem here is that usually science, how does a scientist check if he's right or wrong or self-deceived? He checks against some external source. So like, if you believe the moon is made of cheese, how do you check if you're deluded or not? Well, you send a probe to the moon, the probe brings back a little piece of the moon, and you test if it's cheese or not, and that's how you check. But this assumes that there is that external source that you can go to get your, to get your validation. Absolute mind is so one with itself and so solipsistic that it can't turn to anything because everything is absolute mind. So when you realize that you are this mind and this mind is all that there is, there's nobody you can ask whether you are this mind. There's nobody you can ask whether you're crazy or not. You can't check yourself into a mental institution and ask a psychiatrist to tell you if you're losing your sense of mind, because the psychiatrist is just a fiction of your own absolute mind. This is very terrifying for people because many people reach the point where they're starting to get to God realization. They're starting to get there. But then they start to see the implications of what God realization means. And it's so radical to them that they quickly back and out of it and drop down into a lower state because they're too afraid of what it means. Usually what happens is that you think you're going insane. You think you're schizophrenic or something. You think you're delusional. Right? So it's so twisted because usually the problem with most self-deception, the problem is that the ego mind is not careful enough. It just stumbles into some stupid conspiracy theory it found online, some Facebook memes, just buys into them, doesn't fact check anything, and then in this way it becomes deluded, right? That's usually how people fall into self-deception. But then this is like rookie level self-deception. Then there's a higher level of self-deception where the self-deception comes from the fact that you're being overly careful. This is the self-deception that happens with someone like a Sam Harris. He's too intelligent to just repeat some stupid Facebook meme, but he's not intelligent enough to realize that when he's having a God realization that he's not losing his mind. Because what happens during a God realization is that your whole physical reality starts to collapse. That's what insanity is the loss of physical reality. In a certain way, there's different, that's a very complex topic. So that requires deep conversation to explain what insanity is. But roughly speaking, it's when you start to lose your sense of reality. You start to, at the very least, it's not really insanity. It's you start to fear that you're going insane, right? So there's a difference between actual insanity and fear of insanity. So virtually no human being understands what insanity is because they've never experienced it. But they start to fear like they're going in that direction, and they quickly drop out of it. So you have to be so intelligent that you realize that there's this higher plane of self-deception. And so when your reality starts to melt around you and you think that you're going insane, you have to say, yes, give me more of that. That's exactly what I need. And that's very difficult to do. It's difficult to do intelligence-wise. Most people don't have enough intelligence to see that. But it's also very difficult to do emotionally too, because even if your intellect can get it, your emotions are going to say, no, 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 no. I just want to go back and be comfortable as a little human. So you see, scientific method can only take you so far. Scientific method applies to studying objects, physical objects in the world, but scientific method does not apply when it comes to recognition of the ultimate nature of consciousness itself. See, God is existence. People think that, does God exist? Does God not exist? This is already the wrong question. God is existence. Existence is actually independent of the things that exist within it. So whether an apple exists or a unicorn exists or a Bigfoot exists, they could exist, they could not exist. That all changes and varies. But what does not change is existence. itself. There is such a thing as pure absolute existence, free of any objects within it. That would be called the Godhead. This is what the Zen people call nothingness, shunyata, the absolute. It can be called emptiness, the Tao, etc., etc. Ein Sof is what the Kabbalists call it, Ein Sof. What else am I forgetting? Mu, the Zen call it mu, mu. Yeah, it's absolute emptiness. But it is existence. So this absolute emptiness exists. It's pure existence. Where is this absolute emptiness right now? It's right here. Look, this is pure existence right here. Pure existence. You're just not conscious of it. So what's not being recognized is how profound existence is. Existence is an absolute. People think existence is contingent, like things could not exist. Existence could not exist. No, existence absolutely exists. So God is existence. God is the empty field within which all objects occur, and God is also all the objects. So God is both existence and all the objects in existence simultaneously. This is why God is so difficult to wrap your mind around, because it's right here, but it's not being recognized. You know what it's like? It's like those, I think they're called stereoscopic images. You've seen those, like those magic picture books or something like that. I forget what they're called exactly. But you know, they have those kind of like books, and it's just like it looks kind of like a photograph with a bunch of like noisy patterns in it. No discernible shape. But then you stare at it and you kind of cross your eyes and you kind of zone out and space out and you struggle with it for a while, and then boom, you see it's a dolphin or it's a sailboat or something. That's really the trick here. So my question to you is just kind of imagine that God is that moment of seeing the dolphin or the sailboat in this stereoscopic image. How do you prove that to somebody? How do you prove to somebody that there is this dolphin there? Because if you just take a scientist and you show him this image and he just kind of stupidly takes his magnifying glass and kind of like looks at every little corner of the image and he's like, I don't see any dolphins. There's no dolphins here. Objectively, there's no dolphin. There's no dolphin drawn on this image. It's in the three-dimensionality that your eye, it's the way it connects with your eyes and the recognition that you have with your nervous system. This is what creates the dolphin. Now, this might seem like, oh, Leo, so then you're saying God isn't actually real. God is just some sort of like optical illusion. No, God is more real than anything science understands. God is as real as this right here. This, it's infinitely real. You can't get more real than God. The reason God can't be grasped is because it's everything. How do you grasp something that's everything? What do you grasp with? God is grasping God. It's like God is prior to concept, language, the human mind, verbal explanations, and communications. If you think about it, if God existed, it created space and time, and it's prior to the whole universe. It's more fundamental than the whole universe. What's more fundamental than the whole universe? Existence itself. So of course you cannot use material inside the universe to describe existence, because existence is pure absolute emptiness. How do you grasp absolute emptiness? Can you point to it with a finger? Well, you can. I mean, I'm pointing at absolute emptiness right now. I'm pointing to it. Do you understand? No, it doesn't help you. Can you see it with the eye? How do you see it with the eye when it is your eye? Your eye exists within emptiness. You don't even have an eye. It's just emptiness. Literally, emptiness right now is looking through what you imagine are your eyes, are just absolute emptiness. So you can't use your eyes to get it. proof, reason, concept, these are material things. These are finite aspects of the universe. Existence is infinite. So proof, scientific method, concept, logical argument, communication, these are all well and good, but what's not being recognized is that these are all subsets of God. God is doing all these things. So the irony is that when an atheist is using his logic and skepticism to sit there and to create arguments against God, that's God making those arguments. The atheist is literally using God's mind to construct those arguments and to convince itself that they're true, but it's just a lower level of God's mind. See, God is a mind that can adjust itself on an infinite scale from 0 to infinity and everywhere in between. And humans are very close to 0 in terms of their minds. So as your mind increases and expands towards infinity, you become fully God-realized. And then as your mind drops down towards that of a baboon, you're just a baboon. You're God acting like a baboon. You're still God, but you don't know that you're God. You think you're a baboon. Another important point here is to examine this notion of falsifiability. Again, atheists, scientists, and rationalists and skeptics misuse this concept of falsifiability. They want to say that, well, Leo, you have some theory of God, supposedly, so let's test your theory. Let's see if your theory is falsifiable. How can we disprove your theory? Leo, you tell us, and if you can't tell us how we can falsify your theory, then Leo, your theory isn't a legitimate scientific theory, and therefore it's invalid and it's worthless, and it's just pseudoscience. And after all, Leo, what measurable predictions does your God theory make about the world? And if it doesn't make any predictions, then it's just word salad. It doesn't have any content to it. See, this is the dogmatic thinking of scientifically minded people. It's generally true when you're doing conventional science that you want your theories to be falsifiable, in the sense that you want your theory to make some sort of predictions and to be able to have some sort of third-person object against which you can measure your theory. Like, if you're saying if your theory is that the moon is made out of cheese, okay, we can test that. We can fly to the moon and we can eat a piece of the moon and see if it's cheese. That's a legitimate scientific theory. But the problem is this is science on relative level stuff. How do you come up with a theory of existence itself? You see, when we're talking about existence, we're not talking about a theory. You can't falsify your own existence. You exist. By the way, take a look. How do you know that you exist? So I can flip this falsifiability argument back on you. I can say, you claim that you exist. Is that falsifiable? Is your theory of existence falsifiable? If not, then I shouldn't believe you that you exist. Prove to me that you exist. After all, where are the measurable predictions of your existence? Leo, I do exist. Look, I can talk to you and I can do stuff to you, but that doesn't prove that you exist. That proves that I exist. You are just me from my point of view. So I know that I exist, but how do I know that I exist? Well, because I'm God. How do you know that you exist? Well, you're confused. You don't actually know whether you exist. The only way you could know if you exist is if you realize that you're God. Then you know you absolutely exist. But you don't even understand that. You don't even understand your own existence because you don't know what existence is. You don't understand that existence is an absolute. You don't know what you exist as. You say you exist, but what do you exist as? What are you? I know what you are, but you don't know what you are. How do I know what you are? Because I know what I am, and I'm the only thing there is. So this falsifiability argument, it only works up to a point, right? Falsifiability assumes contingency. It assumes that something isn't absolutely true. Absolute truth cannot be falsified. You cannot falsify absolute existence. It's too fundamental, right? So what's happening is that science is happening at a very surface level. All of science is a very surface level engagement with reality. Conceptual models and schemes and beliefs and all this. It never penetrates deep into the ontology of what anything actually is. Science uses a bunch of symbols and equations to manipulate and to make predictions. That works up to a point, but you have to realize that there's a rock bottom to reality to which those equations and methods and falsified, none of that shit can reach down to the bedrock of existence, the being level. Now, usually what science does is it says, well, anything that can't go down any lower, that just means there's nothing lower. Because science assumes that science can do science on everything. It never occurs to science that all of science is just second order. There's a first order. There's even a zero order beneath that, that science will never reach. But of course, it's not convenient for scientists to admit this, because then it threatens the authority of science. Then it's like, well, science only applies to certain areas and not all areas, but science wants to hold itself as applying to all areas. There is an assumption within science, for example, that reality is contingent and not necessary or absolute. That, for example, existence cannot be a tautology. Tautology is assumed to be a mistake, but it's not. God is absolute tautology. God has to exist. God cannot not exist. That's the most important aspect of God. Its existence is absolutely necessary. But this presents a problem to materialists, scientists, and atheists because they are only used to dealing with relative stuff, contingent stuff that cannot exist or exist depending on various circumstances and factors. They've never dealt with it with an absolute before. And so they instinctively react negatively towards this idea of anything being tautological, right? Like absolute truth cannot be tautological. Or can it? It must be. Because it's absolutely true. It's true under all circumstances. And all of logic actually hinges upon consciousness and absolute truth, just in ways that are not very obvious. You have to go very deep in your consciousness and in your development to understand how logic arises out of the existence of absolute truth. That's not a simple thing to understand or to explain here, so I won't even try. But if absolute truth didn't exist, then logic couldn't work. That's something I'll explain in the future. This leads us to the problem of self-evidence. In the end, there's absolutely no way around at least one self-evident thing. You cannot have any working epistemology or metaphysics or sense-making or knowledge without something being self-evident. Whether you're doing science, religion, anything, you need something that's self-evident. Because without that, you couldn't know anything. So, for example, self-evident things that are common within human knowledge are things like reason, logic is taken as self-evident, the law of non-contradiction is taken as self-evident, the law of identity is taken as self-evident, analytic statements like bachelors or unmarried men is taken as self-evident, various primitive mathematics like 1 + 1 = 2 is taken as self-evident, intuition can be taken as self-evident, the existence of other people is often taken as self-evident, scientific method is often taken as self-evident. Direct experience can be taken as self-evident. Induction. These are just some examples. You need something like that to have any kind of epistemology. But what is the most self-evident of all things? It's that you exist and that you're conscious. There can be nothing more fundamental than that. Everything else depends upon that, because if you don't exist and you're not conscious, there can't be logic, there can't be science, there can't be a universe, there can't be other people, there can't be an external world, there can't be objectivity, there can't be history, there can't be time, and there can't be space, and there can't be atoms, there can't be anything. All of that assumes that you exist. So very paradoxically, the reason God cannot be proven is precisely because it exists. Existence cannot be proven because it's the only self-evident thing. It's the self-evident thing. Existence is absolute self-evidence. Existence exists to itself, for itself, not to a human, not to a subject, not to a brain, not to a biological living being. There's just existence. Existence exists as an absolute. That's what this is. This has been mistaken for something else, which is the illusion that God spins to construct a human life. God is existence. It is not even proper to say that God exists, because God is existence. Anything that exists is God. The reason that a proof cannot prove existence, do you understand this? Look at this. Is because for a proof to be able to prove anything, it first has to exist. So how can a proof prove existence when it already exists first? See, it can't. It's like a hand. My hand can't grasp itself. My mouth can't bite itself. A knife can't cut itself. And a proof can't prove existence. That's the beauty and magic of existence, is that it's so fundamental, it's so profound, it's so serious that nothing can point to it, nothing can touch it, nothing can grasp it. You can't think it, you can't have a concept of it, you can't have a theory of it, you can't prove it, you can't do a science experiment to prove existence. But you can recognize it in the same way that you can recognize your face in the mirror. And of course, the reason scientific method cannot prove existence is because scientific method first has to exist. Existence is prior to all things. You see? Before there was scientific method, there was existence. And before there was proof, there was existence. And before there were humans, there was existence. And before there was a universe, there was existence. Before there was math, there was existence. Before there was physics, there was existence. So God is absolute self-evidence. But the problem with self-evidence is that it requires intelligence. Self-evidence is not evident to everybody. And in fact, the only way that it's possible for anyone in the entire universe to know anything at all about reality is because God is the only means by which anything can be known. When you see a red apple on the table, the only reason you can see that apple is because you are God. When you know that the moon is not made out of cheese, but made out of rocks, the only way you can know that is because you're God. If you were not God, you could not know anything. So the mistake that science makes is science assumes that Without God, things could be knowable. But of course, that takes consciousness for granted. That assumes that consciousness would be there. But of course, consciousness is just God. The mind here plays a trick by using this notion of self-evidence. What it does is that since nothing can be known without self-evidence, the mind preferentially picks certain things that it likes to hold as self-evident due to its biases and cultural priors and all that kind of stuff that we discussed. And it allows itself that self-evidence, but it does not allow other kinds of self-evidence, which contradicts its own worldview. So the ego mind is using self-bias to give itself a sort of a benefit of the doubt when it comes to self-evidence. And then other worldviews, it denies the self-evidence of those. And this is question-begging, of course. Every view has to take something as self-evident. The question is, what are you taking as self-evident? And of course, the ultimate solution to this problem is that you only need one self-evident thing. It's not science, it's not logic, it's not math, it's not 1 + 1 = 2. It's none of that. You don't need any of that. The only thing you need to be self-evident is you need existence to be self-evident. If existence is self-evident, everything is self-evident because everything is existence. So you only need one self-evident thing, which is God. And once you got God, that answers everything. God solves everything in one fell swoop. Of course, the problem is that it's such a radical solution that the mind can't grasp it. It's too total, it's too radical. And the real mindfuck of it all is that you can't check it against anything. It's not like you can have a God realization and then realize, oh, I'm God. And then you're like, wait a minute, maybe I'm not God. Let me go ask that guy over there. Am I God? Tell me. Reassure me because I'm unsure. I'm insecure. Tell me if I'm God. Oh, so you told me I'm God, and that guy told me I'm God, and she told me I'm God, so therefore, okay, I can be secure that I'm God. Is this how God works? No. It can't work that way. If you're trying to do this kind of process to reassure yourself, that means you haven't realized the absoluteness of what you are, of your consciousness. You are an absolute mind. Your existence is absolute. You're not recognizing it. And no one can reassure you. Here's a very interesting and powerful point. Notice that to accept any rational argument, you have to take the validity of reason as self-evident. All of us pretty much take the validity of reason as self-evident because we couldn't even talk otherwise, and we certainly couldn't make sense of the world. However, there is something that's more fundamental. God realization through direct consciousness is actually more direct and more self-evident than the validity of reason. How is this possible? Because reason is a function, a second-order function within consciousness. You can have consciousness and existence. Consciousness and existence, by the way, are identical. You can have consciousness and existence without reason, but you can't have reason without consciousness and existence because reason has to exist. You have to be conscious of it. Reason is just one function within consciousness. Reason requires language, symbols, concepts, and a process across time. Reasoning takes time. Reasoning starts and stops. You're not reasoning all the time, constantly. There are moments in your life where you're not reasoning at all, and yet you still exist. You're still God. You're still conscious. See, consciousness is not a process and it's not a method, contrary to what people think, contrary to what science says. So existence is more fundamental than reason. You can't reason your way to existence. You have to exist first, then you can reason. A lot of rationalists don't get this very basic point. Now you might say, but Leo, science tells us that perception cannot be trusted. So you're talking about perceiving God, but perception is fallible, right? No, I'm not talking about perception. I'm not talking about perceiving God, because your notion of perception is already metaphysically loaded. It's a very conceptually loaded notion. Consciousness and God and existence is metaphysically prior to perception. So even though right now, right here, this is perception, I am perceiving stuff and you're perceiving stuff, but what you're not recognizing is what the perception is. Perception is actually absolute existence. It's absolute. Science has told you a story that perception is something that's happening, in the eyes, in the nervous system, the brain, a living creature organism in the external world is perceiving something. This is all second order conceptual stuff. This is not absolute. What I'm talking about is cutting through all of that conceptual construction to just experiencing this present moment absolutely. That means it's an experience that's so direct that it's more fundamental than experience, even though it's not different from experience. Colors, sounds, shapes, it's all here. It's all fine. It's just that you're not recognizing it as absolute. That's the problem. The absoluteness of it is being missed. You're still conceiving of it as a perception. So actually, there is a possibility of bypassing perception to direct consciousness of absolute truth. That's what I'm talking about. So I'm not making the case that God can be proven through an experience. I'm not saying simplistically here, like, one day I had a mystical experience where Jesus showed up to me in glowing in white, and therefore now I believe God exists. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is that right now I am perfectly conscious that this is God. I'm so conscious of it that I'm too conscious of it for it to qualify as what you consider a perception. I'm not perceiving God, I am God. I'm so conscious of God that it transcends human perception. This is what is called direct consciousness. Now, of course, the scientists and atheists will say, but Leo, your brain is still interpreting your realization of God, so you could still be deceiving yourself. Maybe you had some kind of mystical experience, but now you're fooling yourself. No, that's not what I'm saying. That's not my claim. You're misunderstanding what I'm saying. I'm saying something much, much more advanced than anything you comprehend. If you think that this is happening in a brain, through a process, through perception, through biology, through molecules, through living organisms, through physics, you haven't realized what I'm saying. You haven't realized God. To realize God is to understand that all of that is a hallucination. The hallucination is not the mystical experience. The hallucination is science. The hallucination is a physical, objective, external world. The hallucination is other minds. The hallucination is anything beyond you, outside yourself. That's the hallucination. You're mistaking what hallucination is. Now you might say, well, Leo, but aren't you maybe you're hallucinating all this. I'm conscious that God is an absolute hallucination. So yes, I am hallucinating all this. And that's the nature of existence, is absolute hallucination. That's God. So your skepticism can't touch what I'm talking about, right? So what I'm talking about, when we're talking about recognizing the absolute, this is a big problem for skeptics, because skeptics, and I was one my whole life, skeptics don't realize that they're creating an identity out of their skepticism. It's a very subtle identity. And so what happens is that there's not room in the skeptic's mind for an absolute, because an absolute would destroy all skepticism, right? So what happened with me is I was so skeptical my whole life. For about 20 or 30 years, I was so skeptical that I questioned everything. I was the most skeptical person on the planet. I questioned everything until I became so skeptical that even my own skepticism imploded on itself, to the point where I realized that I exist as an absolute hallucination. And so here I am. See, this is the true fruition of skepticism. So I walked the path. I walked the skepticism path all the way to the very end. So I know the entire skepticism path. So you can't out-skeptic me, because I know every trick that skeptics fall into, because I fell into all of them myself, and then I've solved those problems. And then I know where it leads, and then it leads to just God. All right, so now let's answer some objections. Leo, so you're saying that God is reality itself, but isn't that just a word game? Why call it God? Yes, God is identical to reality. The reason we call it God and not just reality is because you're not recognizing what reality is. You're thinking that reality is a contingent clockwork system that's made out of a physical mechanism that exists as an object outside of yourself. That's a mistaken understanding. That's a failure of recognizing what reality is. Reality is an infinite mind that is hallucinating and dreaming and is infinitely intelligent and is spawning this hallucination purely out of nothing. When you recognize that, you recognize that that is what God is. God just is an infinite mind. So the difference between what I'm talking about and anything that any scientist means by reality is it's night and day. Night and day. I live inside the mind of God. A scientist does not. A scientist is sleepwalking like a zombie down the street. When I walk down the street, I understand that I'm walking through the mind of God. When a scientist walks down the street, he's so asleep that he thinks he's walking through a three-dimensional physical world that is not his own mental construction. That's the difference. That's why this is not a word game. Now you might say, well, Leo, but what's the difference between a physical world and a mind? Like, isn't it just two different words for the same thing in the end? No, it's a different experience. My experience of my existence is different than yours. Radically different. Even though it's not like, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I see unicorns flying around me. I still basically perceive this room the way that you would perceive it if you were sitting in my place. You would see all the same stuff. I don't see any like ghosts and goblins and dragons flying around and all this kind of new age shit. I don't see any of that. It's just that I'm conscious that this is absolutely my own mind. And a scientist is not conscious of that. For example, I'm conscious that I'm hallucinating Albert Einstein. A scientist does not understand that. A scientist actually believes that Albert Einstein is some sort of thing that existed before him. Okay, next objection. But Leo, so you're saying that God is consciousness. But isn't that just sort of a God of the gaps argument? Because science still hasn't figured out exactly what consciousness is. That's the mind-body problem. Very difficult problem. We haven't figured it out yet. And so, Leo, aren't you just kind of like trying to stuff your beliefs in God into some argument, and so you're just turning to consciousness because science hasn't figured it out yet, and one day, in 100 years, science will finally figure out consciousness, and we'll have a mechanical explanation of consciousness, and once that happens, then your whole argument will fall apart here. So, God is not an argument. Consciousness is not an argument. I'm not really making an argument to you. It's much more fundamental than that. But also, no, science will never understand consciousness. Because consciousness is, the only way to understand consciousness is directly. You are consciousness. You can't understand consciousness through any kind of scientific process. Sure, you can study different neuroscience, you can do all that, but you can't actually grasp the nature of what consciousness is through science, through any kind of method. You need to, the only way is directly by awakening. So it's not a God of the gaps at all. I'm not claiming that consciousness is God, but then other stuff is not God. No. Everything is God. There's nothing you can think of or say or do that isn't God. No matter what you say, it's God. If you write a comment down in the comment section saying, "Fuck you, Leo, go kill yourself," that's God, right? There's nothing you can say that isn't God. The next objection is, but Leo, aren't you just trying to mystify consciousness? Why can't you just admit that we don't really know what consciousness is? Why do you need to turn it into this supernatural thing? After all, if consciousness is just the physical universe, then, where is like the spiritual stuff? Where is the mystical stuff? It's just trees. You're saying that trees are God and cars are God and dogs are God. Okay, we can I can even admit that to you, but then but I don't see any spiritual stuff. So 2 answers to that. Number 1 is that, first of all, there is spiritual stuff. The reason you don't see it is just because you haven't developed your mind. So you could see all sorts of spiritual phenomena that is like supernatural. If you want to see weird fucking creatures and entities and shit like that, you could see it. You just need to meditate a lot, develop your mind, and you could start to see that kind of stuff. Take psychedelics, you could see that kind of stuff. So first of all, you're just wrong that there isn't spiritual phenomena. There is. You're just very deeply, profoundly inexperienced. You're basically like a guy who's saying, "Oh, Leo, I've never seen kangaroos and giraffes and crocodiles and elephants." And then I ask you, yeah, well, where do you live? And then you say, "Well, yeah, I've lived in Kentucky my whole life." And I say, "Okay, we'll travel around the world." And you say, "No, I'm just going to keep living in Kentucky my whole life." Yeah, well, okay. Then you're never going to see a kangaroo. To you, a kangaroo is just a mythical creature. An elephant is just a fantasy. Because if you insist on living in Kentucky, that's your choice. See, the problem with scientifically minded, atheistically minded people is that they live in such a bubble. The STEM field bubble is so hermetically sealed, and they don't even understand this, that they don't even experience spiritual or mystical phenomena because they're just so locked in. All they do is they just live within academia. So that's one answer. The other answer is that where is the spiritual stuff? Again, you're misunderstanding what spiritual stuff really is. Spiritual stuff is not unicorns and aliens floating around in some 4th dimension. This is the spiritual stuff. When you look at a tree, you just see a tree. When I look at a tree, I see a spiritual miracle of existence, because that's how deeply my mind comprehends what a tree is, because I'm so conscious of the tree. The tree doesn't need a bunch of bells and whistles and ghosts flying around it for it to be spiritual. The tree is spiritual. You just don't see it because you're blind. The whole point of awakening is not that you get to live in a new age dimension of spiritual beings. It's that your very mundane existence becomes spiritualized. You realize that existence is spirit. But Leo, isn't all this just rationalization and mental gymnastics that you've cleverly figured out because you want to believe in God? And you're just reasoning backwards from your conclusions. Look, I've never believed in God in my entire life, and I still don't. And I think belief in God is stupid. And I think if you believe in God, you're an idiot. This is God. The problem is, like, there's only so much power that language affords me, right? I can only help you so much. Words can only do so much. If you want to interpret everything I'm doing as just mental gymnastics to try to validate my own priors and my attachments, then there's nothing I can say against that. You know, it's like one of those impossible to defeat. It's an unfalsifiable argument that you're making. I can never prove you wrong, because in your mind, you can just always say that anything that Leo says is just some rationalization for some bias that he has. Okay, well, I mean, if you want to believe that, then you're going to be stuck, right? See, you're creating your own reality. You're creating your own view of me. That's your interpretation. So just, all I can tell you is just be conscious of the kind of interpretations you make of the things that I say. There's always multiple ways to interpret what I'm saying. You could interpret me as just being deluded. You could interpret me as being, have some sort of nefarious purposes or motives, or a liar, or some kind of grifter, or you could interpret me as telling you the way that it actually is. Consider all those possibilities. By all means, consider them all. Be skeptical. Another objection is, but Leo, your version of God is so different from the conventional Christian version. Isn't what you're talking about here just kind of a dodge? Like aren't you moving goalposts? When you say reality is God and consciousness is God and a tree is God and an apple is God and you are God, that's not what Christians talk about. Well, you're right. And I have a lot of criticism of Christianity because Christians are fucking deluded fools. They have badly corrupted and misunderstood what God is. And in so doing, they've corrupted and deluded pretty much the entire world. See, the pernicious aspect of Christianity is not only that the Christians delude themselves. Christians even delude the scientists and the materialists, because even the scientists and materialists are now arguing against the straw man, that, corrupted version that Christianity has erected of God. So I totally get it if you find Christianity silly and absurd and nonsensical. It's because it is. You're not wrong about that. But Christianity has no monopoly on God. Christians, the early ones, they had some experiences and some realizations of God, but the problem is that Christianity got corrupted thousands of years ago. It turned into a vehicle for power and human survival, and so that's what it is still today. And so the actual consciousness of God has long been lost out of Christianity. And so it's just it's just a shell of its former self at this point. So it might seem like I'm moving goalposts, but really what I'm doing is I'm just clearing up the corruptions within our mainstream Western culture, the Judeo-Christian culture that we're a part of, that my audience is mostly a part of. I'm just clearing up the corruption, the mistakes, the confusions. That's what's necessary. And the only way to do that is by having a very profound personal experience, consciousness of God. And then it becomes very easy to see what all the corruption is. I can look at any person talking about God, and within minutes I can recognize that they're full of shit, that they don't know what they're talking about, because I'm living God every day, right? Like, if someone was talking fantasies about your personal life, your personal experience, you would be able to tell that they're full of shit instantly. The only reason Christians and others are able to get away with it is because most people are not conscious of God directly. So Christians can bullshit all over the place and nobody corrects them. And it's considered offensive to even try to correct them. Or it's considered arrogant and presumptuous. So let's conclude all this. The upshot of all this talk about proofs is that the reason God cannot be proven is because God is more fundamental than any proof. I recommend that if you haven't recognized God for yourself directly, please be an atheist. Atheism is a very rational, sensible position before awakening. That's all well and good, but also be skeptical of your atheism as well. Don't be biased in your application of skepticism, and also pursue the truth. Explore in an open-minded fashion things that you've heard from me and from other places, and see how far you can push it. See how far you can push your skepticism, your philosophy. Look for contradictions in your worldview. Look for assumptions that you've made as an atheist. There's many, many of them, which we've talked about above. And do not use any proofs of God to uphold any belief about God. It's better not to have any belief, because that's what's most true for you. If you don't have a direct consciousness of God, then there is no God for you. That's fine. Now, someone here might say, well, Leo, but isn't it better to have faith? No, it's not better. The reason it's not better is because your thinking is too short-term. Faith makes you feel good, but faith does not allow you to engage in a deep, serious, truth-seeking process, which is necessary to realize God. Do you have faith that you're alive? No, that's silly. You don't need faith that you're alive. You know you're alive because you're living and breathing right now. Faith is something you need, the ego needs, because it's unsure of itself, and it needs to reassure itself, and it's not comfortable not knowing. Not knowing is closer to truth, and God is truth. So if you want to realize God, you want to be closer to God, you don't need faith. What you need is not knowing. You need to be honest with yourself about your relationship to God. And if that means that you have no relationship to God, that is the truth. What I notice is that people who talk about faith, people who try to rationalize why their faith is important and so forth, none of these, I don't see any of these people engaging in a profound truth-seeking inquiry, philosophical inquiry into the nature of existence. I don't see them doing this. And that's not a coincidence. That's because their faith is preventing them from even seeing the need for that journey. I also want to caution you, do not let people ramble vaguely and cluelessly about God, quoting scripture, mythology, Jungian archetypes, doing all sorts of guesswork. Whenever one of these people tries to talk to you about God, cut right to the point. Cut to the matter, which is that they don't know what they're talking about. They don't have direct consciousness of God. So here's a few questions you can ask them if one of these sort of theistic people tries to bullshit you with stories of God. Ask them this. Do you know, ask them this. How do you know that God exists? This gets you into the epistemology right away. And you will see that they quickly betray themselves by quoting the Bible or some silly proof or some sort of intuitions that they have, and they will quickly betray that they don't have a direct consciousness of God. Then you ask them, do you know what God is? Tell me what God is. And they will start to tell you. And you will see that they're talking from just beliefs and dogma. They're not talking from direct experience. And you can further ask them, how do you know that that's what God is? Because see, a lot of people will claim to believe in God, and they will even claim that they know God exists for absolute certain. But then when you ask them, how do you know what God is? That's a much more difficult question. They're not going to be able to answer that because they don't have a direct consciousness of it. And then you ask them, do you have an experience of God right this second, right now? And you ask them, take your finger, right now and point to God for me and just see what they do. And you will see that they will crumble. They will not be able to do it. They will be lost, and you will quickly see that they're full of shit. At the same time, do not let scientists, atheists, rationalists, and skeptics gaslight you either. They have no understanding of epistemology or ontology. They're not serious philosophers. They don't know what they're talking about. And understand that science is a relatively low level of intelligence and consciousness. It is not ontologically aware. It is not self-aware. It is not epistemically aware. And it holds all of these assumptions that we talked about. See, you can use everything I talked about here as ammunition to deconstruct any scientist, any atheist, any materialist, any skeptic, any rationalist. They won't have answers to these questions. People like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Sean Carroll, Lawrence Krauss, Alex O'Connor, Matt Dillahunty, Michael Shermer, these sorts of people. Do not let them gaslight you. They do not understand reality. They do not understand epistemology. They do not understand how the mind understands anything. They do not understand consciousness. They do not understand philosophy. They seem intelligent on the surface. They're good at arguing. They're good at being very rational. But this rationality is a rather low level of intelligence compared to what is actually possible. In the end, I want you to notice that all of these conceptual problems that we've been talking about arise because nobody takes epistemology and ontology seriously enough in our culture, in our society, even within academia. And so the reward you get for taking epistemology and ontology seriously is you get God. That's your reward, the best reward possible. And if you don't do those things and you don't take them seriously, then you are forever damned, in a sense. Lost in a bubble of your own self-deception. Now you might say, but Leo, you act like you know God. How arrogant of you. About that, I do have a very advanced, direct understanding of the structure of God, which I did not get from any book. I didn't read it. I didn't get it from any guru. I figured it out on my own, for the most part. Now, of course, I did read a bunch of books, but my understanding of God is so profound that it transcends anything that you'll find written in any book. Nobody could understand what I understand from reading books. It's impossible. However, with that said, my understanding of God is incomplete, and there's still much that I'm figuring out every single day. My understanding of the structure of God is growing. There's a lot more that I will yet understand. And I don't ever expect to understand all of it, but, it's pretty good as far as what you're going to find out there in the intellectual public space. But just understand that I'm not sitting here as some sort of like know-it-all. I have a profound appreciation for aspects of God that I still need to work on, that I don't understand nearly enough. And it's a lifelong journey. But also I want you to understand that real progress is possible. Real progress is possible. This is not just empty theorizing. And also I want you to understand that there's many degrees of it. So, there's many, many degrees of it. And you don't really appreciate that until you start to get deeper and deeper into seeing it for yourself. Just remember that the realization of God is not guesswork, it's not speculation, it's not theory, it's not belief, it's not faith, it's not even intuition, it's not a probability. absolute truth exists. And so I'm inviting you on a journey to figure that out and realize it for yourself, not as a belief system. And the existence of God does not contradict science. Science is a dream within the mind of God. Science is the study of certain phenomena that arises within the mind of God. I recommend that you get serious about epistemology and ontology. Give these subjects the mental energy and attention and care that they really deserve, because these are some of the most tricky and thorny domains that a human mind can study and try to comprehend. And I recommend you deconstruct all human paradigms, and ultimately that you awaken to the fact that you're God. And that will be the best day of your life. All right, I'm done here. Stay tuned for upcoming episode, which is going to be Leo's unique proofs for God. I've come up with about 10 proofs for God, which are very powerful and unique, based on my direct consciousness, right? Not theories, direct consciousness. So that's coming soon. And as far as what's coming in the future, I've also started to, my understanding of God's structure has really evolved and deepened over the last 6 months, let's say. And I've had a profound realization into the importance of logic and how logic relates to the structure of God. There's a kind of an absoluteness to logic, but it's a hairy sort of topic, because also there's the absoluteness of logic, but then logic is also misused and co-opted by the ego. So the human applications of logic are different from the actual logical structure of God itself. And so that whole topic, we'll be covering that in the future as well. And I'm still exploring that myself. I'm not fully clear on it yet. So a lot of advanced stuff like that is yet to come. If you haven't checked out my blog, please do. I'm posting daily on the blog, lots of profound examples, videos, clips, links, some of my favorite products, music, all sorts of interesting, cool stuff, quotes, funny jokes, memes, all that stuff you'll find on the blog. If you haven't checked out my Life Purpose course, check that out. Check out my book list if you're looking for some powerful, some of the best spiritual books. Check out my book list.